I want to welcome you to the Retro Rogues Live. Please pay attention to our fancy Wonder graphic. It states that the Retro Rogues Live show is intended for an adult audience and not intended for children under the age of 13. Parental discretion is advised. Again, I want to welcome you to the show. My name is Dave Beatty. I'm one of your hosts. I have my cam turned off tonight. I didn't have time to shave. There's been a lot of chaos and craziness going on in the studio, and hopefully some fun announcements coming very soon. But it's had me incredibly super busy and running around like a chicken with my head cut off. So it's going to be one of those shows for me. I want to welcome back my co-host. This is Mr. Eric Alexander. Eric, please tell the folks hopefully watching or listening at home some of the fun things that you have done as a creative professional.
Yes, hello everyone. I am Eric Alexander, and it even says that this time on the setup. And that's because I do a different show and I forgot to change it. But I am also known as Bass God 14. That's bass god, not bass god. That's bass, like a bass guitar. That's actually going to be very relevant for one of our main topics today, because we're going to be talking about Disney The Mandalorian score. And so a little bit of my recording experience is definitely going to be part of my review for that show. In addition to being in a band for many years as a bass player in several bands, including one called Shades of Silver and another one that was called the Violent Control. We had all sorts of different names. I'm also the editor and the co-publisher of a comic book that was the official tie-in for the Occupants feature film.
Very cool. And then I forgot to mention for over the last 30 years, I've been a professional illustrator and graphic designer. But enough about that. We're wasting valuable time. So if
I think we got plenty of time, Dave.
Okay. Well, I think most of the people are hopefully watching the show are familiar with some of the things I've worked on. If you're not familiar with it, just IMDb Dave Beatty comic artist, and you'll get so many hits and search results, it'll make your eyes bleed. But I've worked on a lot of stuff, and I'm very proud of a lot of that stuff. And one of them actually is the Occupants tie-in comic. Hopefully pretty soon I'll be able to announce some other fun. Like I said, I'm hoping to be able to announce some other fun things soon. We're right on the cusp of a bunch of interesting fun announcements, but we're just not quite there yet. But hopefully very soon. All right. Do we want to go ahead and get started with the main topic?
Yeah, I think we could go right into it. Let me bring up the banner here.
All right, very cool.
I even have an image that we can bring up as well.
Awesome, very cool. So for our first topic tonight, we are going to be talking about the Disney Gallery. Of course, the series is focusing on The Mandalorian, and we were talking about the latest episode that actually launched last Friday or was made available last Friday on Disney Plus, called Score. As the name obviously suggests, we're obviously going to be talking about the music and the score for The Mandalorian. Now, Eric has mentioned previously that there is kind of some controversy about the score itself. I haven't had too many issues with the score. I think the score is actually quite good. And I love movie music just in general. I'm a big orchestral movie soundtrack buff. I recommended and talked about last episode, there's a great place called La La Land Records. They do a lot of limited release stuff actually on CDs. That's right, folks, CDs, physical media. But I have a very extensive collection actually on CD of movie scores. It includes everything, obviously, from the obvious classics, the reference to Star Wars, like, of course, John Williams' Star Wars movies, but also a lot of other more eclectic things. I have, scores for things like Die Hard, and I have scores for things like Heat and all kinds of other kinds of films, because I love all kinds of movie music. So anyhow, enough droning on about that. We want to talk about just our initial thoughts, our overviews before getting too deep dive into this. So tell me, Eric, what was your initial impressions of this particular episode of the Disney Gallery Mandalorian score?
Well, I found it very interesting. As I mentioned in the intro, I was involved as a bass player in bands for a number of years, numerous bands. And so I do have quite a bit of experience recording in a professional studio. And I also had created my own home studio at one point. Unfortunately, my home studio now is terribly out of date because the main mixer I have for it uses FireWire, and none of the new computers use FireWire anymore. But aside from that, it's something that I had quite a passion for many, many years, and it's a tough gig. It's tough being a musician, and it's tough recording. It's tough performing, and it's tough composing. It's tough when you write your own music. I actually did dabble a little bit in writing my own music as well during that time period. So this episode does have I guess a special place in my heart because of that, because of all those trials and tribulations. And I found it very interesting because I would say that this is probably the most different episode, not just in terms of content, but in terms of focus. Because one of the nice things about this episode is there's this tremendous focus on the composer. And in fact, many of the other roundtable participants that we've seen in every single other episode, at least once, they're not in this. A lot of the directors are not in this at all. A lot of the visual arts people and things like that we've seen in pretty much every other episode, they're not in this. The actors, they're not really in this either, other than when they show the finished product. They really focused on the composer, which I thought was really interesting because I knew absolutely nothing about this man. And it was really interesting to see his process and also see his style. I was a little, I wouldn't say taken aback, but I was a little bit surprised about, just I guess sort of his manner and kind of the way that he was. He's certainly not John Williams, and I don't think he tries to be John Williams. And they mentioned that, in this particular episode, that they were definitely trying to go for something different. And that's where I think a lot of the controversy has come from, is that this is a very different score than your typical Star Wars films. Even I think a lot of the side projects, the music is different. Although we did mention on a previous episode, we were talking about the animated Droids cartoon. And of course, that had a very different intro, that was actually done by one of the members of the police. And Stuart Copeland, I think, right? The drummer for the Police is the one who composed that. And that was very different. I remember even as a kid thinking, wow, this doesn't sound like Star Wars. This is kind of like a weird kind of trippy quasi rock song or whatever that style exactly was. So in a lot of ways, it feels like The Mandalorian is kind of taking from some of that, of those previous Star Wars television projects. Which I think Jon Favreau is, in a lot of ways, it's intentional. And he does mention that in this episode. He does talk about that, how they were trying to be kind of different. And I do want to acknowledge some comments from the Rogues Gallery. James, glad to have you back. He says, "Evening, gentlemen. Since we are discussing orchestral music, I thought I would highbrow it a little in my greetings." So we appreciate that. Keep it all high class here, right, on Retro Rogues Live. And then Matt, my friend from Portronics Film Productions, says, "Looking forward to tonight's show." Matt, I'm glad you were able to come on for a little bit and say hi. And I do want to give a shout out that's actually for the both of us, because we recently completed all the principal photography on a short film project, and we have sent all of that film to our editor. So that's hopefully something I'll be able to talk about in the future about that project that Matt and I are working on, because hopefully that will actually be done very soon. But Dave, what were some of your thoughts as far as sort of like I said, like you mentioned, that I've talked about some of the controversy that apparently you're not aware of, but there are people that absolutely hate this score. But that was a key point that they talked about in this series, that they were deliberately trying to do something different.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly have enjoyed the music for The Mandalorian. I haven't had a lot of issues or complaints or problems with it at all. But I think, in all honesty, I think most of us as Star Wars fans by now should be used to music being slightly different, whether you're talking about, obviously, a lot of the music from Clone Wars, or you're talking about the music from things such as, even Rogue One. Rogue One doesn't sound like a classic. I mean, it gets there, but it starts so different because it doesn't have the crawl and the music's different. So for me, when The Mandalorian starts, I didn't have a lot of issues with the music, and I quite liked the music. I was a little shocked that the main theme is that basically played on a recorder. That was kind of crazy, I remember,
Yeah, I was very surprised about that. I was like, wow, that's pretty funny almost.
Yeah, and when I think of a recorder, I just think of kids in like middle school and stuff learning basic music, with a recorder. So I was kind of shocked to see that the main theme that we hear so much of in The Mandalorian, which sounds sort of kind of otherworldly, but also kind of westerny at the same time, was basically just played on a recorder. That was kind of a little stunning and shocking for me. I wasn't too terribly familiar with the composer either, but like I said, I quite like the music. So my initial impressions was I found this all to be terribly fascinating. As I've mentioned previously on the show, I love any kind of process behind the scenes stuff. Some of the best behind the scenes things that's kind of like what the Disney Gallery Mandalorian series is, for example, like when they released a couple of years ago, they released, I think it's called Alien Quadrilogy or whatever it's called. They released up until that point all the Aliens films that included what was the name of the last one? It's so bad because I had a hat with the logo on it. But anyhow, it was the last one that had Sigourney Weaver in, essentially. Those actually each one came with a bonus disc, and those bonus discs had some of the most amazing, interesting, in-depth sort of documentaries about the creation of those various films. For example, the Alien 3 one is so terribly interesting because of all the controversy of what happened with Alien 3 and how we eventually wound up with the film that was made. And then I also always recommend that people check out, if you can get a hold of it, the Daredevil, the theatrical release Blu-ray, had a really great documentary on it. And it's just so crazy to see how much they went through with that. At one point they talk about in that documentary about how one of the producers was stuck in traffic, and he had a phone conference going, and all these executives were arguing about the color red and basically running a couple seconds of Ben Affleck in costume back and forth, really losing their minds and concerned that the color red wasn't going to work. They thought it was too cartoonish and whatever. So it's really interesting, just all these behind the scene things. But this is the first one I've seen that really gets this in depth with a composer who's done a score. Now, of course, obviously we've had John Williams on some of the Star Wars, DVD, Blu-ray extra type things, but I've never seen one that's quite this in depth. But I found it very, very interesting, and I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, as you mentioned, I didn't know much about, well, actually, I didn't know anything about this composer. This is the first time I even saw his name, and I have it up there on the screen for everyone. I can pronounce his first name, Ludwig. I believe the last name is Göransson. I'm not sure. But I didn't know anything about his work or anything like that. I was completely unfamiliar with him. So I went into this with almost a completely blank slate, not knowing anything. I was surprised about the recorder as well. In fact, as a kid, I remember learning about the recorder in a music class in like second grade. One of my daughters has been doing recorder lessons in school. That, just like you said, I associate the recorder with that, with like an instrument that you use to actually teach, children, the large groups of children that are not necessarily even musically inclined, how to teach them about music. And so it's interesting to me that's an integral part of the score. The very sort of distinctive opening sort of the opening music for The Mandalorian. That do 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 do. I mean, that's all done basically on a recorder. It's fascinating to me, although one of the recorders he uses is much more elaborate than the one that you see the little kids use and stuff like that. But yeah, I went into it with a lot of a blank slate in terms of not knowing anything about this man. And I think it's really interesting, again, that unlike so many of the other episodes of The Mandalorian, where we kind of see the same faces over and over again, this is really the first time you see him in this series. And the series is really just all about him. They really don't get into a lot of the other folks that were involved with the creation of the music for The Mandalorian. It's really all about him. And so they show his process of how it is that he composes. They do show his interaction with the orchestra. They show his actual mixing board, which is crazy. I've never seen a configuration like that before, because unlike a traditional mixing board that you have sort of, people think of where you have it sort of like a table and it's in front of you and you mix with it, he has a mixing wall with all these different mixers that can get him all these incredibly unique sounds, which is a little bit discouraging as someone who is interested in that kind of stuff in terms of producing music and things like that, because I'm like, wow, I don't know if I would ever be able to get a collection of mixers like that. I'm happy to have the one Mackie mixer I have, and then I recently purchased this little mixer here for the show that I've been trying to test out and things like that. And that's about the extent of it for me. Oh, I've got that Firewire mixer that I can't really use anymore. I've got that. But he had a wall of mixers, and I've never really seen a configuration quite like that. I've certainly seen professional studios, where they do have all sorts of equipment on the walls, but not this vast number of mixers like he had. So he's got this sort of definitely his own unique sort of style in terms of the way that he creates music and also the way that he records it, which means that a lot of those sounds are probably pretty unique and difficult to duplicate. And it seems like he's grounded a lot in analog. He's not a big like digital computer type of guy. In fact, one of the things that he emphasized was that his primary instrument is the guitar. That's what he first learned on, and he has this really old Roland guitar synthesizer that he uses with the guitar. And he was talking about how it's a really unique machine because it's so rare, and it's from the 70s. And again, it gives sort of that warmer analog sound that's virtually impossible to duplicate on a computer. So there's always that big rift, by the way, when it comes to musicians and composers, people like that, as far as people that really embrace the new technology as far as what computers offer, and those that are more analog. And he does seem to be more sort of on the analog side, which is kind of interesting because this show, as we've talked about, has so many technological innovations and is so technology heavy. And yet he was emphasizing a lot of the more analog approach that he has to the creation of music and also in the recording of music, which I found to be an interesting contrast to the rest of the show.
It was interesting. And, they didn't really touch on it at all, but when he was over at his mixing wall and he was messing with it for half a second, it made me think of all those science fiction films where there's the computer wall that someone's throwing all the random dials and switches on, and there's lights everywhere, and it doesn't really make any sense to any normal human being, but somehow the person who's operating it, because it's their spaceship or whatever, they understand what's going on there. It made me think of that, and I was surprised they didn't take a moment to show like even just a little snippet of Han Solo at the what was it, when he was having problems with the Falcon and Empire, trying to get the what was it, the light speed engine to work correctly, and he said plug 3PO into the hyperdrive and figure out what's wrong with it. I was surprised it didn't show that just him standing there flipping switches for half a second, just for the funs and giggles of it.
Well, I think he's pretty serious about what he does. You know what I mean? I think that he definitely has at least in this episode, I get that indication of a lighthearted nature, but I think he's very serious about his job. You know what I mean? And very serious about his equipment. I know how musicians are and producers, music producers are with their equipment and their music and all that stuff. They take it very seriously. You know what I mean? Especially when you've collected that diverse amount of equipment that he has.
And James is nice enough to point out that Alien Resurrection was the film I was having a hard time thinking of the name of. Thank you. Yes, Alien Resurrection. One of my most infamous claims to fame is I was in, was it Tomart's Action Figure Digest? I think Tomart's Action Figure Digest was Star Gods back in the late 90s, and we were talking about the action figure line that was supposed to happen but didn't happen. But there's a picture of the founding members of Conquest Studios, which was Scott Clark, Dean Zachary, and myself. And I was wearing an Alien Resurrection hat. It's one of the few pictures of me in a magazine, and I'm wearing an Alien Resurrection hat. I'll let you all just kind of digest that. I had got the hat for free and was very excited about the film. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Scott Clark and I are huge fans of the Aliens franchise just in general. We often talk about, Ridley Scott's, masterpiece that is the original Alien film, and of course James Cameron's Aliens. And I am a huge fan, actually, of Alien 3 for all the wrong reasons. This was why I like Alien 3. But anyhow, enough about that. We're supposed to be talking about Star Wars, right? But anyhow, yes, Alien Resurrection, that was the one I was trying to think of. But those documentaries are really interesting. That's the point, as I continue to ramble on incessantly about something that has nothing to do with Star Wars. But no, my overall takeaway from this, it was really interesting. I enjoyed sort of the focus they actually spent with the composer. That was the thing I really liked, is just the fact that they just really focused on him and his particular contribution and his method. While I liked the round table nature of the other films, I found myself kind of going, no, it'd be kind of cool if we'd spend a little bit more time with just Filoni or just Favreau and why the Mandalorian, why this way, why now? I know those sound like completely silly, stupid questions that I know have been kind of answered, but I just enjoyed this kind of more intimate portrait. For example, talking about Jon Favreau, I keep seeing Jon Favreau drawing on shows, and no one really talks about the fact that this man can draw. For example, if you pay close attention, he's actually drawing the Mandalorian during one of the scoring sessions. I believe that is him who's actually drawing. And then in his one of his episodes of his chef series that's on Netflix, when he actually goes and actually visits with Robert Rodriguez has a sketchbook, or is it? I forget. Anyhow, they start drawing in this sketchbook. And it's just, I just find it really interesting because no one really talks about the fact that Favreau is really into cartooning and art, but I think he is. and
I've never heard that before. I didn't catch that scene that you're talking about at all.
It's real brief, but he's actually drawing the Mandalorian while they're doing the scoring session. It looks like it's on a yellow pad and notepaper. It might possibly be Filoni, but I definitely think it's Favreau who's actually the one who's doing the drawing. And like I said, I know he's one episode of his chef series on Netflix, not the movie, but the sort of cooking show that he does with one of the guys that trained him for the movie chef. And there's a scene when they go and they visit Robert Rodriguez, and they're actually making pizzas of all things. By the way, highly recommend that if you haven't seen that chef series on Netflix. It's really cool. But Robert Rodriguez is really big into like fire oven pizzas, and he makes all these crazy pizzas and stuff. So they're making pizzas on that particular episode. And I think it's Rodriguez that has a sketchbook, or Favreau has a sketchbook. But in that one, Favreau actually draws, and he draws this crazy dragon thing or whatever, and it's really kind of cool. And that's the thing. I enjoyed the more intimate's not even maybe not the right word. Sort of the more solitary focus on this one particular creator and their one particular contribution. And I kind of like to have one of those just with Favreau and just Filoni too. But I
agree. I agree with you that this episode stands out because of the way that it does focus on Ludwig. It does focus on the composer, and it totally stands out from the other episodes. The other episodes, to me, seem to have a very sort of set format, almost formulaic, and this one is very different. It really is a spotlight episode, so it really does stand out. So, it's kind of interesting. If you haven't actually been liking some of the other episodes, maybe you dropped out after episode 3 or something like that, you didn't like the style, this would be an interesting one to check out, because if you didn't like it, one's very different. And it very much is a spotlight. But I will say, as far as Favreau and Filoni, I mean, they're kind of spotlighted in every single episode. I mean, they really are, actually both of them, I think, personally, are highlighted in almost every single episode. There was a big Filoni moment in this episode where he was talking about working with George. And again, I use the term George Lucas loyalists, the Lucas loyalists. And Filoni, once again, was praising George Lucas and talking about how he used to work on music with Lucas, and emphasizing the fact that a lot of the things that they're doing on The Mandalorian are just like what George Lucas taught him. I love it how he always throws in things like that. He's almost like the George Lucas historian, and he's always throwing stuff like that in, because obviously he worked with George Lucas in a very personal way for a number of years. And Favreau doesn't have that. Favreau doesn't have that pedigree where he actually was at Lucasfilm in the era of George Lucas. So I think it's kind of neat when Filoni will come up with those little stories, because he does it all the time, where he comes up with these little stories about working with George Lucas and sort of comparing what they're doing today to what they did with Lucas in the past. It always seems to be that Filoni brings up the point that, it's just like just like how, George and I used to do things. It's exactly the same kind of process, which I think is really, really neat, because he seems to really be advancing that. Incidentally, one thing that he did that I don't know if you noticed or not, Dave, but I noticed it glaringly, was Filoni was talking about the different kind of Star Wars fans. It actually had to do with a little bit of discussion about the people that did not like the music for The Mandalorian at first. And the composer was making the point that a lot of people that hated it in the beginning, by like, say, episode 4 or 5, they were starting to like it. Like they kind of switched gears, because he did acknowledge that controversy, that a lot of people hated the score when it first came out. And Filoni started talking about how people, have these sort of expectations because of the eras that they grew up in. So, there's people like myself who grew up in the original trilogy era. There are people later on that grew up during, he acknowledged, the expanded universe era. And I've met a lot of fans like that, who basically, during that big glut where there were no Star Wars films, they became fans based on the expanded universe. So we gave a shout out to them. Then, of course, he talked about the prequel fans, people who grew up on the prequels. I've met people like that. And that's where that was their original Star Wars. They grew up going to the prequel films as a little kid. And then he acknowledged the people that are into Clone Wars. And there is like this section of rabid Star Wars fandom that's about the Clone Wars. But you know what he didn't mention? He didn't mention anything about Disney Wars. Did you see that, Dave? He didn't mention a thing about it.
I did notice that he didn't mention anything about sort of that current new era really at all. That wasn't missed on me. I did notice that. So.
And also, I have to say this is I don't know if we were at that point, but this is my favorite episode because Kathleen Kennedy's not in it. She does not appear in this episode for one scene. They don't have her at the round table. They just have Filoni and Favreau and Ludwig. She's not involved at all, which I noticed that as well, which I was like, finally, because I honestly don't know what she was contributing in earlier episodes. I just don't. And there's all sorts of rumors of infighting between Favreau and Kennedy as far as for creative control over the direction of Lucasfilm in general, and certainly this show. I think certainly this show, there's something there. There's some sort of conflict going on within Lucasfilm over the creative control of this show.
Well, I don't know if that for certain, but I did notice that, as you stated, that Filoni just kind of skip over, the newer era of Star Wars films. That was very noticeable to me. And again, like I said, I kind of like, just to be on the record again, I kind of like Force Awakens, and there's some elements of Rise of Skywalker that I think are interesting. And of course, I love.
Well, you mentioned you and I both like Rogue One. Yeah,
and
you did mention how there's a difference in terms of music, because there was some controversy with the music of Rogue One. I remember there was a Star Wars a podcast that I was really into, and I used to really like watching these guys. And one of the things that kind of got me away from watching them was they were just really, really trashed the score of Rogue One. And what I got from that, of course, was that, a lot of that criticism was coming from, well, it's not John Williams. Well, it's like, well, John Williams did not compose this. So trying to pretend to be John Williams, to me, would be terrible. You know what I mean? That would be awful. It seems to me that a lot of these new composers that come into Star Wars, they do have to kind of acknowledge that, but they also they need to they definitely need to get beyond that, because nobody's John Williams, right? I mean, nobody is John Williams. He's a legendary composer. He's probably going to go down in history with Beethoven. You know what I mean, Dave?
Yes, I would agree. And of course, Rogue One, the score was by Michael Giacchino, which a lot of people have probably recognized some of his music from things like The Incredibles. Of course, he did the score for Speed Racer. He did the score for the newer of the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films. I quite like Michael Giacchino's music, so I didn't have a lot of issues with the score for Rogue One. To me, it felt like Star Wars in the right moments, but felt kind of new in the right moments too, because it should feel like that classic year of Star Wars, but it should feel like a different story, because we're not really dealing with sort of the Jedi and a lot of the other elements that kind of give it a more mystical kind of sound, or magical kind of sound. Is sort of the way I think of it anyway. That's probably incorrect, but that's just how my mind personally puts it together. Which actually, Michael Giacchino, for people who are familiar, the film Cloverfield doesn't really have much of a score per se, because it's supposed to be sort of a found footage film. But one of the things that's interesting about the original Cloverfield is basically in the end credits, and if you actually do a search, you can actually get, quote unquote, the score for Cloverfield, which is just sort of that, Godzilla B movie, sci-fi monster score kind of music that actually plays at the end of the film when the film actually ends. And that's by Michael Giacchino, and that's actually really cool. It's called Roar. So like I said, I'm a huge fan of movie music, and I could go on about this forever. So,
yeah. Well, my point is that I think I definitely agree with Ludwig's approach, that and also Favre said this, is that they knew they couldn't be just exactly like the rest of Star Wars. And my point is that there's only one John Williams, so why even try? So I feel like the criticism for the most part is it's not legitimate. You know what I mean? Because you kind of have to do something different to do some sort of cookie cutter, watered down version of John Williams. I don't think would have been good. And also, Favre mentioned that, of course, this particular series is supposed to be inspired by the things that inspired Lucas, and that's things like those old samurai movies, westerns, that kind of stuff. And I think we talked about that in our reviews of the Mandalorian series, Dave, that we felt that was one of the good things about the score, was it definitely gave you a little bit more of that sort of western feel to it, a little less of that stargazing orchestral stuff that I guess John Williams does.
Yeah, no, I would totally we, like you said, we brought that up before, and we discussed that quite a bit on the show when we were actually reviewing the episodes of The Mandalorian specifically. And like I said, I really like the score for The Mandalorian. I think it fits incredibly well. And I do like the fact that they did take a different approach, and they did, kind of look at it in the way in which they did, because it doesn't not only does it obviously give the show its own particular sound, but it does kind of, steer away from that risk of, oh, well, this is just someone trying to do a John Williams knockoff, But it's so funny because there's so many great music that's inspired by John Williams and inspired by Star Wars. It's so beautiful and so cool, too, that is orchestral. I think about David Arnold's score for Stargate, for example. But no, there's all kinds of, I don't know. I agree with what they did, and it was very interesting to see this again. The word I keep coming up with is intimate because they're mostly just dealing with just the composer. I just found it all very, very interesting.
Yeah. No, it stands out. It's a standout episode. There's no doubt about it. Stylistically, in terms of the content, obviously in terms of the focus, it really is a standout episode. It's much different than the rest of the series.
Very cool. Well, that's all I've got to say about this. Do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, other than I would say, as I mentioned before, if you kind of didn't like this series before and maybe you had some issues with it, this is a very different episode, and this might be one worth giving a try. The next episode coming up, we've got one episode left to review, and that one is called Connections. So that'll be interesting because I don't know exactly what that means. Do you know what that means, Dave?
I would assume that we're going to talk about how The Mandalorian connects back to not just the original Star Wars and Boba Fett, for example, but I think they might give us a little bit of information, for example, about the saber that Moff Gideon has that connects back to the Clone Wars. I think that's what they mean. They're going to talk about how this sort of plays into sort of classic Star Wars lore, and I'm curious to see too if they actually bring up the expanded universe since Filoni brought it up. I wonder if they're going to talk about.
Yeah, that was nice. I have to say that was nice because I'm not an expansion universe guy. I've mentioned that numerous times on the show. The most I really ever got into the expanded universe was the Thrawn trilogy, and that was because my brother had the books, and so I read them. So I never really got into the expanded universe that much. I did do a lot of the games, which I think a lot of that is considered part of the expanded universe as well, because some of the games had very intricate stories, like Shadows of the Empire. They did a game for that. That was actually considered, that was considered to be everything except the film. Do you remember that? That project was basically supposed to be like, we are going to do everything we would do for Star Wars except making the actual movie. So it was this kind of crazy project, and I remember playing the game. I played the video game, the N64. So I've never been a huge expanded universe person, but that doesn't mean I don't have sympathy for those of you that are. And I do feel for you. I saw it coming, though, but I feel for those of you that lost the expanded universe, when Disney basically said none of that stuff is canon anymore. I know people that are still upset about that. I know Star Wars fans that was the main thing they liked, was the expanded universe. It wasn't the original trilogy. So I do appreciate, even as someone who is not necessarily in that camp, I appreciate Dave Filoni mentioning that and putting that out there, because a lot of those fans kept Star Wars alive in between the films because there was a long period with no films.
Very true. And so much of that was so interesting and so much fun. I of course, read what they call the Heir to the Empire, the actual comic book based off of Heir to the Empire. Of course, I read all the Timothy Zahn books. I remember quite fondly, but I don't remember the specifics too much about the one that focused on the bounty hunters. It had that really early Boba Fett story. Of course, we had all the great comic books, coming out from Dark Horse. I mean, there was so much great material, and then you talk about the games and the role-playing game, and it was just so much wonderful material in the expanded universe. And it was a shame that they seemed to disavow so much of it. And I didn't feel like, in all honesty, it was necessary to disavow a lot of it. I mean, I think Star Trek fans, for the most part, understand that the books are the books and the shows are the shows and the movies are the movies. You know what I mean? And we all kind of grew up with that concept and kind of understood that.
I have to disagree with that. So here's my thing, and I've said it before on the air, and I actually had this experience through the Star Trek fan community first. What I realized was when I was reading some of these books, I realized that, first of all, the cast members didn't read them. I remember, actually, I think it was a Star Trek convention I went to with Patrick Stewart, where somebody asked him, hey, have you ever read any of the books? And he's like, no. He's like, you have to understand, it's like, this is what I do for a living. So in my free time, I don't really want to be reading Star Trek books. And of course, later on, Patrick Stewart admitted that he doesn't like science fiction at all. there's a famous interview. I think it's called the captain's room or the captain's chair, and Whoopi Goldberg actually interviewed William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, Patrick Stewart, and Jonathan Frakes, and they talked about Patrick Stewart in particular, and Jonathan Frakes talked about how they're not sci-fi fans. They've never been sci-fi fans. And Leonard Nimoy even kind of looked like he was taking offense a little bit, like, so you guys never watched our show? That kind of a thing. And of course, William Shatner has mentioned he's never watched any Star Trek. And, he's never watched Star Trek Next Generation. He's never been to any of that stuff. But as far as the books go, I realized very early on that the actors, the producers, the directors, they don't care about that stuff. They might take some things here and there. In fact, we're seeing that, I think, with Disney Wars, where they've taken various elements of the expanded universe and kind of redone them. That's actually my argument for what they're trying to do with the High Republic, is that they're trying to do their own spin on the Old Republic, which, Knights of the Old Republic, which a lot of the EU fans are really into. I think they're kind of stealing it. But the big problem is that when it comes to those heavy hitters, those big players, the studio heads, the producers, the writers, the directors, the actors, they just don't give respect to that expanded material. They never have. And like I said, I saw that first through Star Trek. And then when I saw people getting into the EU with Star Wars, I was all like, guys, they're going to pull the rug out from under you. And look what they did. Look what happened.
Whoops. I didn't turn my camera on. Sorry.
That's all right.
Anyhow, look at that. I had clothes on. The point I was just making is that I know that in kind of Star Trek circles, we eventually kind of learned that, the books are fun for what they are, but the books are just the books. You know what I mean? They don't necessarily give you a ton of back information that's going to be referenced, in a show or a movie necessarily, unless
I still see that argument, Dave. I still see that argument on Twitter all the time. But there was a book that said.
No, I understand there's people that feel that way, but I'm just saying, I know there were some of us that understood, that even from the jump that, these things are not necessarily connected, even though you would hope they would be. Now, I'll also say too, I know there's some people that thought it was, gospel truth, and there you go. But I'm just saying, it's like, I just remember reading all of it and stuff, and the stuff that I enjoyed, I still own quite a few. I actually have all of Zahn's books still. To me, it, whatever they've done doesn't really diminish that material still exists, and it's still great for me personally. For example, like, I've talked before about, Richard Hatch's Battlestar Galactica books and how much I enjoyed those and how I'm glad that those exist, because those of us who grew up with classic Battlestar Galactica, here's a through line from someone who loved that material very much and carefully crafted all these really great fun stories that takes so many interesting concepts that might have only been in, one or two episodes of the classic series and explores it even further and actually, takes the characters and advances them forward in age, and you get to continue to live within that world. Because hopefully at the end of the day, for me personally, that's what I like the books and the comics and stuff to do. I don't always expect them to take that and be literal, because at this point, I'd like to think most of us have realized that they don't take the stuff from the comics and the books literal and then adapt it. They always change it. They always make additions or subtractions. Sometimes they're improvements and sometimes they're not. So, but yeah, boy, I could talk.
Yeah, the problem. Well, the problem is, of course, with Star Wars is that it was very much marketed as being canon. So the expanded universe was meant to be like the continuing adventures, of all of our friends from the original trilogy. And then they even went into, prequel era type stuff with the Knights of the Old Republic and things like that. So, in fact, I remember there used to be a list that they gave out talking about conflicts. And, of course, the movies were on top. And then I think it was like the radio plays were second. And then the third, I think, was the books. And the third was, and I'm talking about the adaptions of the movie books. then it was like the regular books, then it was like the comic books. Like there was a whole hierarchy that Lucasfilm had officially. And of course, a lot of fans were really invested in that because canon is important to a lot of the fans. It's something that's really important to them. It's like, oh, so this really is something that quote unquote happened in this fictional universe. And then what happened when Disney bought Lucasfilm is they just erased all that stuff. So basically decades of marketing, meticulous marketing to all these fans who kept this franchise alive in that long period where there were no films, because there was a huge period between Return of the Jedi and The Phantom Menace. There's a huge period of a no man's land. There was a time period where no Star Wars toys were being made anymore. And it was those fans that really kept the fandom alive and kept it going again. And ultimately, they kind of got screwed.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but that's corporate America for you, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, and it's also a good example of, if you're an independent creator, which Dave and I both are. We're both independent creators, and George Lucas can be argued to be the most successful independent creator of all time. Although I could make the argument for Walt Disney, by the way, that he was the most most successful independent creator of all time. I think you could make an argument for either one of them in that role. Once you sell your stuff, you lose control. I think there's a reason that Walt Disney never sold his company. And isn't it ironic that his company eventually bought Lucasfilm? What an irony, huh? Two giants of independent creativity, independent cinema, all that stuff. And, there you go. And here we are.
It's an interesting coincidence, that's for sure.
Now, we do have some folks in the Rogues Gallery that were saying hi. Jane says hi. Good to see you. And Bobby, he's also said hello to everybody. So, Bobby, we appreciate you being here. And, Bobby, I did want to mention we had discussed the film that you had recommended that we review, and we're still discussing that. The issue being that I don't have Amazon Prime. So that's the only issue right now with the film you recommended. But we're going to keep looking into that because we do take suggestions. And we're committed to one more episode of The Mandalorian. We've got one more coming up. That's the Connections episode I talked about earlier. And then we do need some new material for the next episode. So Dave and I will talk about whether we're going to review the film you suggested or not.
Yeah, and I had suggested, too, there's that sci-fi channel Dust that has a lot of interesting productions that are on that. So we are actively discussing, what to talk about next. And I know there's also a suggestion about doing Space Force. And then I saw that I think isn't PJ with Orville Nation? I think I saw that he was actually talking about Space Force. I know I saw part of an episode where he was discussing.
I saw a part of that. I didn't get to see much of it because I think I was actually editing at the time. I was in the middle of doing some stuff and I wasn't able to actually look at the full episode. Plus, I have not seen the series yet. So I don't want to really be spoiled or anything like that because I haven't watched a single episode yet. But that is one that we were talking about. And yeah, PJ did do an episode, but he was, from what I saw, he was really asking people what they thought of the show without really interjecting a lot of his own opinion. Maybe PJ will show up later and we can talk about that again as far as that possibility of maybe even us doing something with him as far as Space Force. So we'll see. There's a couple different ideas there, but I wanted to acknowledge Bobby's suggestion in that right now the only issue is I don't have Amazon Prime, but I may go ahead and just get it, because I do want to be open to suggestions from the Rogues Gallery. And I have heard quite a bit of buzz about that movie, Bobby. The stuff I've actually heard has been very mixed. I've heard people really like it, and I've heard people really hate it. So, we'll just see what happens.
And it's interesting, too, because I don't think most people realize, but, Eric and I, while we both live in the same state, we're actually pretty far apart from each other. It's not like we're in, one town close to the other. So it's not like Eric can come over, one night and just watch it. I mean, for him to come over or for me to go there is like a production because we're pretty far apart. So just so people understand, it's like you might be thinking, it's like, oh, well, what if you guys are in the same state? I mean, I would think they would imagine that we live like within the same town, but we're several hours apart. So it's not a simple production by any stretch of the imagination. But no, yeah, I'm interested in all of this. All of this stuff sounds interesting. I have seen promotion actually recently for Vast of Night actually on Amazon. What else was I watching on Amazon? I've actually had a lot of documentary stuff on Amazon. I've been on a real documentary kick. There's this really older documentary actually about comic books that was actually made in the 80s. Comic Book Confidential. That was available actually to watch on Prime. So I rewatched Comic Book Confidential. Now that's an older comics documentary that features, all kinds of comic creators from underground comics to, at that time, contemporary mainstream creators. So you see, really young versions. Well, not really young, but you see, Frank Miller. He's very young in it, talking about Dark Knight. Dark Knight had just recently come out, or had just recently been out. They spend a lot of time talking about the underground comics movements, talking about, Robert Crumb. He's actually interviewed in it, as well as the Hernandez brothers, talking about Love and Rockets. Anyhow, it's a very interesting documentary. So if you've never seen it and you have Amazon Prime, search out Comic Book Confidential on Amazon Prime. It's really cool. But I've been watching all kinds of documentaries about different things, and I've seen Vast of Night actually promoted to me on multiple occasions. I go, hey, that's that thing that Bobby suggested. So there's that,
and he does mention his opinion that yes, it's very mixed. So
right.
That actually does intrigue me even more, Bobby. That makes me want to watch it even more if you're saying that it is mixed, because sometimes that can be interesting. That can definitely be interesting to review when something is mixed and you're like, I really like this, but this sucked. You know what I mean? I really like this, but this sucked. You know what I mean? And that happens a lot in independent cinema. Guilty as charged right over here. That just happens. You know what I mean? Sometimes, especially when you have a low budget. One of the things I used to see all the time when I used to run the Phoenix Comic-Con Film Festival, one of the things that was heartbreaking, and it actually kind of goes along a little bit with our previous topic when we were talking about The Mandalorian and score, because we're talking about the importance of audio. And man, I would see these films that were really done pretty darn good and on a shoestring budget, where the filming was decent, the acting was pretty good, the story was compelling, and they screwed up the sound. The sound was off. You know what I mean? Like the sound was just terrible. Like it was like they were filming on a camcorder and they just used the camcorder mic, and the camcorder mic really sucked. That kind of a thing. Just killed it. Just would kill the film. So that does happen with, in terms of independent filmmaking. Sometimes the issues with the production value can be problems. That's actually one of the criticisms I've heard about this particular film. But Jane gave a suggestion, which is that we should do a series review of Star Wars Rebels, which would be a massive undertaking if we did the entire Star Wars Rebels series. But I think possibly we could do a couple of episodes or something like that, Dave. That might be a good idea, because I haven't watched a lot of Star Wars Rebels because I didn't have cable, and it was on, I think, Disney X when it first aired, and I don't have cable, so I do have Disney Plus, and Star Wars Rebels is on there, so that might be an idea. That might be something where we at least take on a couple episodes or something like that. Dave, what do you think?
Well, that sounds like a good idea. And I would also recommend actually a couple episodes, because I did watch the last season of Clone Wars. I would actually recommend a couple episodes of Clone Wars to actually go along with a couple episodes of Rebels, because I think, for example, like it would be really interesting for us to get kind of into the whole Ahsoka, her high point journey, since she's going to be showing up in The Mandalorian. And I'd also do like the idea of exploring, what exactly happened between Anakin and Ahsoka too, the falling out and why it went down the way it went down. Because at the last episode of, well, I'm not going to get into it because that's spoiler territory for something, but anyhow, I'm just going to say there's a lot of interesting stuff.
You want to give us the spoiler, Dave? You want to give us the spoiler? You don't ever do that.
I'm just saying there's a lot of interesting material that could specifically play into themes and ideas and things that might be touched on in Mandalorian, specifically in relation to Ahsoka. So I definitely think that would be interesting from that standpoint alone, just for us to have a better, more rounded understanding of Ahsoka's journey, before she, hopefully shows up, because she's rumored to show up in the next season of The Mandalorian.
Well, along those lines, Jane has a really great suggestion, and that's kind of actually the 5-second delay. James says the 5-second delay. You've been paying attention, James. But Jane had a great suggestion that I was kind of thinking along those same lines, which says, do something about the black sword, about the Darksaber. And I don't know a lot about the Darksaber. I mentioned on the air, I had to go on Wikipedia to find out what that was, because after that episode aired, I just saw like hashtag Darksaber all over the place. And I was like, what the hell is the Darksaber? I have no idea. So that's a good suggestion, I think. And that's along the same lines of what you're talking about, Dave, is maybe we can tie in some lead up, especially I think as we get closer to, I think October is when the next season of The Mandalorian is going to start. Maybe we could do some sort of a lead up, especially since you've watched a lot more of this stuff. We could do some specific episodes that are going to be crucial for the next season of The Mandalorian, kind of like what we did with Picard. You remember, Dave, the same thing we did with Picard.
Yes,
we did a lead up to it. Yeah. So
I think
we could definitely work on something like that.
Yeah, I think it'd be good. And then plus it gives us an excuse to come up with interesting names for shows like, Legacy of the Darksaber Special, or something silly like that. So, yeah, I like that idea. I think that would work really good. Very, very cool.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. So I think that's definitely something we're going to look into.
Very cool. Are we good to move over to pop culture news?
Yeah, let me bring up the banner. And yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and set it up here real quick. So here on the pop culture news segment, we talk about something, anything, or all things that we find interesting in the world of pop culture news. Now, if you've seen any of the previous episodes, sometimes it's talking about collectibles. Sometimes it's talking about stories. Sometimes it's talking about shows. Sometimes it's talking about comics. It's anything and everything in the world of pop culture news that we find interesting that we want to share with you. Now, unfortunately, this week, I'm going to be really light. Actually, really light is actually a stretch. I'm probably not going to have, I'm not going to have anything pop culture news and streaming wars. But like I said, there's some fun, exciting announcements coming up soon, because there's something that's been eating up a ton of my time. But I think everyone's going to hopefully find it really exciting once we're able to announce what it is. But unfortunately, I don't have anything for pop culture news. Although I was going to talk about that $45 Conan action figure, because I thought that was crazy. Looks like Arnold from the original Conan film. But that's going to be it. It's just going to be my name drop. So tell me, Eric, what do you have for this episode segment of pop culture news?
It's kind of funny this time, because I've got a lot of stuff that I think relates pretty well to the streaming wars. So I'm going to try to be careful and try to select stuff that isn't directly tied to streaming wars. But there's been a lot of stuff going on, on that front lately, in particular with HBO Max and Warner Brothers. And I feel like a lot of this episode, I'm going to be ragging on AT&T and what's going on with DC and Warner Brothers. And so this I thought was really weird and interesting. I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know if you heard about this, Dave. So this is from a site called Games Radar Plus. And it says DC announces its biggest ever online event. It will feature Wonder Woman 1984, The Batman, The Suicide Squad, and more. Zack Snyder's Justice League, Black Adam, and a whole lot more will feature in the Fandome event. And it says, buckle up, superhero fans, as DC has announced its biggest ever online event. With San Diego Comic-Con going online this year, DC has decided to start its own virtual event Fandome, which will be accessible for anyone for free. No badge required. For 24 hours, the website will be accessible around the world, offering fans of the biggest movies, TV shows, and comics coming over the next few years. It says Warner Brothers has pulled out all the stops when it comes to the movies they will be showing off at the event, including The Batman, Zack Snyder's Justice League, The Suicide Squad, and Wonder Woman 1984. While talent has yet to be officially confirmed, Dwayne Johnson has confirmed he'll be part of the event to promote his anti-villain movie, Black Adam. Anti-villain, interesting. I haven't heard that term before. The official release teases new announcements from WB Games, film and TV, and comics, including Aquaman, The Batman, Batwoman, Black Adam, Black Lightning, DC Superhero Girls, DC Legends of Tomorrow, DC Stargirl, Doom Patrol, The Flash, Harley Quinn, Lucifer, Pennyworth, Shazam, The Snyder Cut, The Suicide Squad, Supergirl, Superman and Lois, Teen Titans Go, Titans, Watchmen, Young Justice, Outsiders, and Wonder Woman 1984. It says one of the more surprising entries there is Watchmen. While the main series and Doomsday Clock spin-off comic series finished a while back, HBO released a sequel TV series that introduced new characters and added content to familiar ones. So, I mean, there's just a ton of stuff. It says it's going to happen on August 22nd at 10 a.m. Pacific time. I don't know. What do you think about this, Dave? Because I feel like this is them trying to one-up San Diego Comic-Con's announcement, and it sounds to me like they're not going to participate in San Diego Comic-Con's virtual con.
Yeah, I'd say that sounds, pretty much on the money. And, as far as maybe, bypassing San Diego and doing their own thing. But, the reality of it is, unless they're doing a presentation in Hall H, I don't see why you would necessarily. I mean, just because they've partnered with them in the past doesn't mean they need to partner with them again. And there's been, occasionally there's been issues, with that partnership with San Diego from time to time. So I'm not too terribly surprised that they're not really being concerned with partnering with San Diego to do this promotion, because it's online and they have their own channels, and I don't see necessarily where they would. Now, if you bring up the idea of loyalty to San Diego and wanting to continue to, be a part of that fandom and that community, I don't know if they're going to be thinking in those kind of terms. That's just being honest.
Well, they're not thinking in those terms at all, obviously. I would say this is obviously, we could care less about that relationship and that whole thing. That's the way I take it.
Right. And that's not a huge shock to me. But I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to see what kind of content they're going to put out, because, if this is basically just like a 24-hour thing. So it's almost like they're going to take all this content, they're going to produce it, and they're going to have available for 24 hours. So you got 24 hours to go in there and digest all this content that you can, and then someone's going to throw a switch and it's all going to be turned off. So I don't know how this is going to work. It's going to be pretty nuts. It's going to be pretty crazy. And it'll, we'll just have to see how well this does or does not work. I've always been kind of surprised.
Well, the interesting thing is that San Diego will be first. That's also interesting to me.
Yeah, but I don't know. I honestly, I still don't understand, even though you were one of the first people to bring up this idea of an online convention, I still don't understand how some of this stuff is really supposed to connect and work with people. Like, I've been a part of a couple things kind of here and there, and it's kind of fun and interesting, but we don't have the connection in that I have right now with the Rogues Gallery. I mean, if someone responds in the Rogues Gallery, we respond right back right away, and it's a real dialogue between us and people who enjoy the show and people who have something interesting to say in regards to what we're talking about on the show. And it does, in a sense, replicate some of that feel of doing a panel at a convention. Like you're talking about your topic and someone in the back of the room hollers out, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, yes, I know exactly what you're talking. Like we have that going on right now. And in all of these attempts to do this sort of like, it's going to be content like at a panel at a convention and no. And it's like, but they don't really interact with the people that are watching. It's like, well, so it's just sort of like a regular streaming show and you're not really connecting with anyone. I don't know. So we'll see. I mean,
I have seen virtual cons where they've been doing that. In fact, I mentioned that on the air. There was one that I was going to kind of promote more on the show. I decided not to because what they were doing was they were actually using Twitch, and they were using Twitch to host their panels, and then that would allow connectivity where people could do questions. But if you wanted to do the original airing, you had to pay. And then on the reruns of the panel, you could just watch it for free. And so I thought that was an interesting model, but at the same time, it was kind of like, I don't really want to pay for this virtual thing. I can understand how, why they were doing it that way. I'm not trying to necessarily dismiss them, but I wasn't going to be promoting them when that might be an issue for people that were struggling financially. The good thing about San Diego Comic-Con this year, and also even this DC event, is that they are being advertised as free. So I'm hoping that although they are free, they will still allow that kind of interactivity that other event that I'm not going to name because it did charge, where they were allowing people to do questions because the technology's there. Just like you said, just like what we're doing right here, we could do this easily as a sort of panel format, with other creators and stuff like that. We could do a panel. In fact, you even talked about doing something like that, some sort of a virtual artist alley to coincide with San Diego Comic-Con.
Right, as sort of like a lead up or something, which I still think would be an interesting show to do. But I haven't seen anyone who's really done just a super stellar job of connecting with people, in the manner in which I think is totally possible. Like, for example, James just posted up blah, blah, blah. And then if we were in a panel room in a convention, I would say, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Hollering trademark Dracula from the back of the room. I know exactly what you mean, James. So that's what I'm talking about. It's not quite as interactive and as interesting as I think it could be. Because to me, it just sounds like they're going to produce a bunch of content and make it available for 24 hours. So it's like, okay, that's interesting. I'll check it out. The San Diego event, I'm just going to avoid because I don't see what the point in that is, to be honest. It's weird because it's like some of the convention exclusives, for example, have been going to different sort of retailers, with like WonderCon and Emerald City. I've been debating about trying to pick up that Captain Atom Funko Pop, for example, because I'm a huge Captain Atom fan. So that's the precursor for Dr. Manhattan for you kids at home. But anyhow, I've been thinking about picking it up, but it was originally supposed to be like an Emerald City Comic Con exclusive, I think. And then they put it on Amazon, and I don't know. It's just I don't know. I don't know. Darn COVID's just messed everything up.
Yeah, well, I think that it can be done better. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And I'm very interested to see what San Diego does, how they manage it. And I kind of feel like DC is going to let them be the guinea pig, even though, DC and Time Warner, I should just say AT&T. I should just say AT&T from now on. AT&T is apparently not, I'm sure they're not going to support San Diego Comic-Con since they're doing their own event. So I feel like what they're going to do is kind of see how the San Diego event goes and learn from it. And that's kind of their game plan. That's the way I take this.
Right. And, it's interesting because, like, for example, when they rolled out the DC Universe, I hate picking out the DC Universe app, but when they rolled out the DC Universe app, they talked about how it was supposed to be this unique way for fans to connect, right? So when I went on there, I set up my profile. I went on some interesting sort of like little threads, kind of like message board threads where people were talking about things. And I went in there and I tried to interact with people. And I was like, oh, I worked on that book. And that book is a lot of fun. And I threw out some interesting factoids and stuff and whatever. And absolutely nobody responded whatsoever. It was like friggin' crickets. So that's what I'm saying. It's like, I have
Wow.
yet to see. I have yet to see where the big companies are able to really connect with the fans. You know, and I don't understand why it's so friggin' difficult, because, like, for example, James was just talking about, he just posted that toy and statue releases, maybe. I know exactly what you're talking about, James. He's hoping they're going to be talking about some of that stuff and showcasing it. You know, I'm curious if they'll do that on this, you know, I would assume they would do that with this fandom event, fandome event that they're going to be doing. But here's what I really want to know. Since it's the fandome, is each one going to start with like an image of the Legion of Doom headquarters if it's coming out of the swamp, and that the fandome is actually happening inside the Legion of Doom's headquarters? Like, can that be DC's version of Hall H? Maybe it should be Hall D, the Hall of Doom. You know, with
That's pretty cool, actually. That's pretty cool, actually.
That's what I would have done, because that's where my event would be happening. It'd be happening in the Hall of Doom. So maybe hosted by Lex Luthor and Mantis and, you know, Gorilla Grodd. You know, something kind of fun.
Yeah, Bobby seems to like that idea. It's giving him a chuckle. So,
well, there you go.
No, that is a good. I like that. I like that idea quite a bit. But the other side of this for me is I just feel that this does show a complete lack of loyalty that AT&T has for its former partners. You know, right now the convention circuit, the convention industry is hurting really, really bad. So the fact that you're going to just go ahead and do your own thing and not participate in this event that's been a cornerstone of pop culture for so many years, I don't know. It just, to me, it gives me a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth.
No loyalty to previous important contributors and partners. Say it ain't so, Eric. Especially
I know, Dave, you have
Warner Brothers.
no personal experience in this, especially with DC. I know we're not talking about you.
I have none whatsoever. I don't know what you're talking about as I cry into my beer.
And I kind of mentioned that's kind of my theme right now, is to beat up on DC. I actually have another article for you in that vein, and I should say, I need to stop saying DC, because, you know, I've always said I am a DC guy. In my heart of hearts, I am a DC guy, more so than a Marvel guy. When I say that, I like the DC characters more than I like the Marvel characters. But I think AT&T, the corporate entity as it is now, has been doing some really, really strange things. And I realize it's a business. I understand that. But still, they're doing some really odd things. And this is actually a good follow-up to something you were talking about before. And so this is from Cord Cutters News. And it says, AT is considering sale of Warner Brothers gaming division for $4 billion. That's a lot of money. It says AT is reportedly exploring a sale of Warner Brothers Interactive, a gaming division that owns several development studios and popular franchises. CNBC reported that major studios like Electronic Arts, Activision Blizzard, and Take-Two Interactive Software are interested, and the deal could be worth $4 billion. The division is responsible for a number of popular titles and franchises, both past and present. Recent hits include Mortal Kombat 11, the Lego game series, and the Hitman series. So I don't know if you heard about this, Dave, because you were actually talking about getting back into gaming because of Mortal Kombat 11, and now look at this. AT&T wants to sell it away. What do you think, Dave?
Well, so much for that.
So much.
Well, I mean, did you hear
about this? Did you know about this?
I hadn't heard about that, but I don't understand. I guess that's me as someone who has, created things, created sort of like, for bear with me, everyone. For lack of a better term, like Eric and I have created a fun show here with the Retro Rogues. there's some things that we want to do with it to help solidify it, as not necessarily as a business per se, but just to, have a little bit more funds pumped into it. We can use for promotion or whatever things, maybe, have some higher production values, make it better for you, right? You who are hopefully watching and listening right now. And most of what I've done has always been along those lines. I've always wanted to have a studio specifically to create certain things. So whenever I see these huge companies going, let's just dump this major portion of our creative ability for $5 because we're done with that. I mean, I understand. Well, I'm gonna be honest with you, even from a bean counter accountant, we got to show a profit at the end of the quarter. It seems so short-sighted. So short-sighted because eventually they're going to want to try and get some of these assets back. It makes me wonder if, for example, like years ago, they did the Mortal Kombat DC game where the DC Universe characters fought the Mortal Kombat characters. That's the reason I was thinking about getting Mortal Kombat 11, because I like the idea of playing RoboCop, because I really enjoyed being, Captain Marvel beating up on Sub-Zero. I enjoyed being Deathstroke the Terminator and taking Scorpion to task. That kind of stuff's fun. But as it kills me because the whole goal once upon a time was synergy, to bring all these different entities together so that they could take all these different properties and, in their terms, and you can read press releases on the internet, exploit these various franchises and properties across all these different media platforms. Well, if you sell your gaming division that's created all your popular games, then you just gave whatever synergy you might have had in the gaming world, you just gave it away. But it also goes back to reinforce what Eric was talking about before, what we've all heard before, at least I would imagine, is the idea that all these companies want to do is they just want to license stuff. They don't really want to create things anymore. They just, it's that whole absentee landlord idea. You buy a bunch of apartments, you rent them out, and you don't think about them anymore because you just want to make the money. But you don't want to go out there and do the landscaping. You don't want to go out there and check and make sure the property's in good condition. You just want to make the money and not have to pay any attention. I understand that, but it just doesn't make sense to me.
This has real roots, especially because obviously Time Warner is, Warner Brothers is part of this conversation. In fact, it's Warner Brothers Interactive. But it really goes all the way back to the 1970s and the destruction of the studio system. When the studio system fell apart, that's basically what happened. Now you have production companies that basically are making the films. The studios are basically involved with like the financing. They're involved with distribution. Obviously, a lot of the studios literally own studios. They own the physical buildings, sound stages, and things like that. But it really gets into what you're talking about is sort of the roots of this phenomenon go all the way back to that era when the studio system was dismantled.
Well, and I can see that, and it just comes back to the same thing. It's just I find it just to be kind of unfortunate, and I find it to be somewhat short-sighted, and you see it all the time. These companies they break off or they sell a division, because they need that influx of cash, which I can't imagine AT&T is hurting for money, but they sell that division off or sell that piece off or whatever because they don't think they don't need it. And then a few years later, they have to reacquire it and it costs them, 4, sometimes 10 times as much as what they sold the thing for in the first place. Because what'll happen is this division, if it's sold off and broken up into parts, it'll end up becoming a series of really super mega successful, gaming franchises. You know what I mean? Here and there, and then other companies are going to snatch them up. I wonder if eventually Disney's going to wind up owning this. Disney's in the business of taking popular things off the table that other people don't know what to do with, and going like, well, we'll put this in our portfolio. We're sticking in our back pocket for when we need it later. So I don't know.
But Disney basically got rid of their interactive division a long time ago. They don't really have an interest in gaming. I think they look at gaming the same way they look at comics, because they've always, like I said, you can go all the way back to Uncle Scrooge, and Disney has had this long history of they have no interest in making comic books. So they've always farmed that out. They've always licensed that out. and they've done the same a lot with their gaming division. As far as I know, the Disney gaming division was closed years ago. They just got rid of it.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing I don't get. I just don't get this. Video games is one of the most popular, entertainment venues that exists on the planet right now. And when you start talking about, VR and all these other things that are either going to emerge or not emerge, how in the world could you be thinking it's like, oh, that part that creates all the video games, the interactive experiences, yeah, we don't need them anymore. Let's just get rid of them. It doesn't make any freaking sense to me whatsoever. And then Bobby just said, have a good night. Just pulled up with my kids at the drive-in. Thanks again. Well, I hope you enjoy your night there at the drive-in with the kids. I'm curious what you're seeing, but definitely have a good time. And thanks for dropping by, visiting, and saying hi. And I still have a sketch card I need to get into the mail to you, Bobby. Again, my apologies. When you all see what's coming down the pike, I hope some of you will understand what's going on. But anyhow, I just don't understand this idea. I don't understand this idea of just, getting rid of your gaming division. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. No, but it's exactly, you're hitting the nail on the head. I think it all comes down to the idea of licensing. And that licensing, obviously, you take on a lot less risk. You just basically say, hey, you can use our IP to make this game, and that's it. You know what I mean? You might have somebody overseeing it a little bit to make sure they don't do anything that's quote unquote offensive to the company. They might have some sort of final approval clause. But other than that, they don't want anything to do with it because they don't want to be involved with the risk of actually producing the game, investing in the people that they have to invest in to make the game, and then whether the game is successful or not. They don't want to take that risk. You know what I mean? It's all about minimizing risk.
Yeah, I understand. I don't like it, but I understand.
No, I don't like it either. I think it's pretty short-sighted. I really do, because when you do that, you obviously lose a lot of control. You know what I mean? There's just no denying that. And Jane mentions, I call it paper shuffling. I work for a company that combined 3 titled businesses. They would sell one of their companies to another one of their companies, all actually the same business. That's interesting. You know what I mean? And you do definitely see that, especially with what we're talking about right now. Because, sometimes I'm saying DC, I really mean is Time Warner, but what I really mean is AT&T. Of course, it's all under AT&T, and it gets super confusing.
And then I do actually have one thing that we probably do need to touch on, Eric. If you wouldn't mind sharing my screen. This is kind of big news. And then if you're sharing my screen, I can't see it. Just because I'm only able to do one screen tonight. I had some issues with my computer. Can you see the screen, Eric?
Yep, it's up.
Okay. So this is on Deadline. I think most of you that are comic book fans, most of you who are genre entertainment fans are probably already aware of this. But of course, Denny O'Neil, one of I would say one of the greatest writers in comics, actually died. He actually recently passed away. He was 81. This is actually from Deadline. This is by Anita Bennett. And it basically says Denny O'Neil, a legendary comic writer who worked for both Marvel Comics and DC Comics, has died. He was 81. O'Neil passed away Thursday. His alma mater, St. Louis University, shared on social media. A cause of death was not given. DC Comics also posted a tribute on its official Twitter account, saying O'Neil's voice will be missed. DC mourns the passing of Denny O'Neil, who co-created some of DC's and the industry's most important comics. Between revitalizing Batman and telling thoughtful stories that address addiction and racism, he told the stories we needed to hear. His voice will be missed. When I think of Denny O'Neil, I think of obviously the Hard Traveling Heroes stories. For those that are not too familiar with that, that was actually the legendary Green Arrow, Green Lantern series that took on a lot of difficult topics such as racism, and the ideas of corporate greed, and that series was really great. Of course, he actually worked with Neil Adams and actually helped to revitalize and give us the new Vision version of Batman that actually emerged out of the 70s, that eventually led to the version of Batman that we know of today, the more dark, ominous, defender that prowls the night. I mean, they really helped to kind of bring that version of Batman back into the public consciousness. But in addition to that, for me, a big one that Denny O'Neil worked on was actually his Question series with Dennis Cohen. I've loved that Question series for the longest time. It's just so interesting, and such an interesting look and exploration of a character. It's just a really fantastic series. I always recommend that people actually look at and check out the DC Comics series from the 80s on the Question. So anyhow, we just want to take a moment and acknowledge Denny O'Neil passing away. Probably should have done it at the beginning of the show. I felt like most people were probably aware, but then I started thinking about it, and I was like, maybe some people are not. But we do want to take just a moment and acknowledge the passing of Denny O'Neil, his amazing legacy. I want to encourage people to actually check out a lot of the work that Denny O'Neil has done. They've done collections and reprinted a lot of his work. If you're not too familiar with Denny O'Neil and you're curious to even get a series of recommendations of things that might be worth checking out, you could always just direct message me. You can contact me and just say, hey, I'm curious to learn more about Denny O'Neil or read some of the stuff that you love that he actually created. And I'll be more than happy to personally message you and give you a couple of recommendations. But I'm going to tell you right now, the Question's going to be at the top of that list. So, Eric, had you heard about the passing of Denny O'Neil?
I had not. I was not aware of that until you brought it up. I'm not terribly familiar with his work, but as I mentioned, I am a DC guy, so I'm sure that there are some of his books that I have read, but I was not aware that he passed. So that's some sad news there.
Yeah. And Denny O'Neil was also a legendary Batman editor, too. He was actually the editor of the Batman series when they did the whole thing with Bane and the breaking of the Bat and the emergence of Azrael. One of the interesting stories about Denny O'Neil is that Batman issue 500 that actually sort of was the emergence of Azrael as the new Batman. Anniversary issues in comics sometimes can be very important for certain artists and creators to be on, especially if a company actually pays royalties, because one of the things that's really great about DC is the fact that they do actually extend to their creative partners a royalty program so that you can still see a little bit of money for the things that you work on. So anytime you get the chance to contribute to an anniversary issue or something that's really important for a character where they know there's going to be a lot of sales, that can be like a huge helping hand to certain creators. For example, one of the things that happened is that Denny O'Neil actually made sure that Jim Aparo actually stayed on Batman up until issue 500. And he was able to see a lot of those royalties because at the time, a lot of people were looking at Jim Aparo's work and feeling like that wasn't contemporary, edgy enough. And a lot of people were questioning why he was still on Batman. But Denny O'Neil actually honored and acknowledged his legacy as an important Batman artist by allowing him to continue to be on the series. And it actually helped him out actually financially, in his later years as Jim Aparo got older. And it was sort of felt that his work was out of touch and he was kind of shushed, kind of ushered, kind of out of the industry to an extent. Denny O'Neil had a lot of loyalty to the writers and the artists that he worked with as an editor. And there's a lot to be said for that. That's the kind of thing that doesn't really exist too much anymore.
We were just talking about how loyal DC normally is, though.
Yeah. But see, that's the difference. That there used to be a time in a day when there was loyalty, Yeah. So just want to say, that there's a big difference between DC Comics at the era in which we grew up reading them, and I'm sure you're aware of, versus, kind of sometimes what's come later. And that's not a huge criticism or a knock. I mean, I worked on a lot of those later books, so I don't want to be too heavy-handed in my criticism, but it's a very different time, I think, just for the world in general. But that's one of the cool stories that comes out of Denny O'Neil's legacy, that that doesn't get talked about too much is, because an editor has the ability to do that, to fight to keep a creator on a book. And sometimes that can make all the difference in the world, as someone's either going into their retirement or they're about to be pulled off of a book for some reason. Displaying loyalty for a creator who's been on that series and actually, looking at it from the standpoint of, we've got an anniversary issue, this could really help them out down the road. That's huge. That's huge. So, and all I've ever heard is such stories about that Denny was just such a great guy. I never had the opportunity to meet Denny. So I did stand in line at San Diego Comic-Con for like 3 or 4 hours in the hopes of actually getting to talk to him. And I actually had a stack full of question books for me and some of my friends I wanted him to sign. And he got up and left right as I was getting close to the table. I guess so sad and dejected, I just got out of line and just walked off. I was just like, fine, whatever. So he was the main person I wanted to talk to, and I never had the chance to meet him. So
that's a bummer. That's definitely a bummer.
Yeah. All right. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Do you have anything else for pop culture news?
Oh yeah, I've got lots of stuff actually. Let's see here. Hey, have you seen the Star Wars Squadrons trailer?
No, I have not. I'm familiar, but I have not.
Well, we have not done a trailer reaction in a long time, and so this would be a legitimate trailer reaction. Are you able to pull this up on your screen? Because you said that your screen configuration is different right now. Are you able to pull this up so you can see it?
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, I can see what you're actually pulling up right now.
You can see it?
Yeah.
All right, so this is for folks who don't know. This is the trailer for the Star Wars Squadrons video game that's supposed to be coming out very soon. It is the spiritual successor to Rogue Squadron. Are you familiar with Rogue Squadron, Dave?
Yes, I'm familiar with Rogue Squadron more from actually the Michael Stackpole novels than necessarily like any of the games.
Okay, so for people that need some clarification there, the first Rogue Squadron game actually came out for the N64, but the GameCube version seems to be the one that resonates with people for some reason. I'm not sure why, because I think the 64 was much more popular than the GameCube, but that seems to be where people come from. But as you mentioned, Rogue Squadron was a whole thing. They even had novels for this, and this is not a direct sequel, but this is supposed to be the spiritual successor. So I'm going to go ahead and play it, and then we can kind of react to it, Dave.
Sounds good.
So as you can see, there's an X-Wing pilot that's being chased by a TIE fighter pilot.
Right.
Now I have to say, I'm guessing this is cinematics. I can't imagine this is actual gameplay footage.
Looks really cool so far.
Yeah, these cinematics look quite good. And by the way, it seems to me that this has some sort of story mode. Like you can see that there seems to be like a specific, this character is a TIE fighter pilot, and then we saw the X-Wing pilot earlier. So I'm guessing that there's a story mode where you can play as either this character, it looks like a female Rebel pilot, or the Imperial pilot. Oh, by the way, I shouldn't say it's Rebel. They do mention, because I did watch this before, this is the New Republic. So this takes place after Return of the Jedi. And that looks like that's Wedge. Did you notice that? That looks like that was Wedge.
Yeah.
So clearly they're using the aesthetic of the classic Star Wars trilogy. But as I understand it, this takes place, again, after Return of the Jedi because there are references to the New Republic as opposed to the Rebellion. That's a pretty cool thing. I want to back that up. A lot of people have been mentioning this, that we have that. Do you know the name of these aliens, Dave? The alien in the green.
Isn't that sort of the same race that Bosk is a member of?
Yes. And a lot of people are kind of excited about that, about the possibility that that might be a playable character, or you could play as an alien as opposed to a human. I don't know if that's true or not, but a lot of people are actually, there's some buzz about that, about the possibility that maybe you could actually play as this alien character. Again, this appears to be New Republic, not Rebellion, or what do they call it in Disney Wars? The Resistance. So it's not Rebels and not Resistance. It sounds like this might actually be the first opportunity to play as New Republic.
And I was just going to mention too, just real quick, before we get too far, which we're already too far. There was an alien on the far end who had kind of a pink, kind of a skin hue to him.
Let me get back to that, so you can.
I could be totally off base, and maybe that's a legendary alien race that's been in Star Wars since forever. But this little alien guy on the end over here, who's kind of a pink, kind of looks like he's got goggles or something on. He kind of reminds me of Greg from Last Starfighter a little bit.
That'd be interesting if there was a little nod there.
Yeah, but at least from this shot, it just reminds me of Greg from Last Starfighter a little bit. I think that's kind of cool if they would do that.
And then we have the Imperial team, which it sounds like this is the Imperial Remnant, not necessarily the First Order. I don't know exactly, like I don't have any inside information where I know exactly what the story is, but I know the audio that I listened to earlier when I watched this trailer. But obviously, very much using the classic Star Wars aesthetic. This does not look like Disney Wars, you know. That was pretty cool. Saw they were taking on a Star Destroyer in an atmosphere. I thought
that was really cool. It looks really neat.
So again, I don't think there was any actual gameplay footage in that. That's the one thing that disappoints me. I think that was all cinematics. It seems to me, if you're you mentioned you haven't played the games, but you're familiar with Rogue Squadron as far as the stories that Mark Stackpole did. In the games, they basically set you up with like missions. So you would do like specific missions, and there was also sort of like as I recall, in some of the versions, because there's multiple versions of the game. Like I said, it came out on N64, and no, James, that was not the Commodore 64. That was the N64 that the original Rogue Squadron came out on. Although I do think the Commodore 64 had some Star Wars games. The first Rogue Squadron came out on that platform, and that's the one I have. Actually, I have the GameCube version as well. And I remember they did a sequel on the GameCube that's really different. It had like a mode where you actually were outside of the cockpit and running around, it wasn't first-person shooter. It was like, I guess, like that over-the-shoulder kind of third-person, what would you call it? Not first-person shooter, but like third-person shooter, where like over-the-shoulder. Like it would switch between those different modes. So I'm kind of curious how this whole thing's going to work, because it looks to me like they're going to definitely have a story mode, and you can choose to be with what I'm guessing is the Imperial Remnant, or you can be New Republic.
Well, that all sounds really interesting to me. I've been talking about, maybe, trying to get back into gaming with the Mortal Kombat and such. And that looks really interesting. I'd be down to play that. I wonder if it's going to be as complicated to fly that as it was to fly the Vipers in the Battlestar Galactica game that was on the PlayStation. Because, boy, those Vipers were hard to fly. They were complicated.
Yeah, I could understand that. I could definitely understand that. And then James had a question about Abin Sur. Do you know what that's in a reference to? He's got a question mark there.
He's referencing the fact that the guy at the end, who I thought looked a little bit like an homage to Greg from Last Starfighter, I could see where he does look a little bit like Abin Sur. Abin Sur was actually the Green Lantern of Sector, I think it was 2814, which was the original, the Green Lantern that basically passed his ring to Hal Jordan when he died. So,
yeah, I don't know the name, but I know the story from the Super Friends cartoon, because I remember that when they showed the origins of Green Lantern, and I always liked Green Lantern as a kid. again, because of the Super Friends cartoon, and they had that character in the cartoon. They showed it when he was dying and he gave the ring to Hal Jordan. So I actually agree with you, James. It does kind of look like him. I couldn't see all that well. The screen is much smaller for me when I'm watching this stuff because, as Dave mentioned, Dave sometimes has a second screen where he can look at stuff. I just have the one. I don't have a separate screen. So I only look at everything through the control room. So the screen for me, when I'm watching this stuff, is actually pretty small. It's much smaller than my actual screen. That's the point. Because I've got all the controls and stuff like that for the studio, as well in my view. So I couldn't get a great look at him, but I definitely do see that. I see what James is saying there. And who knows? Maybe it's an homage to either one of them. You never know. It's possible.
And there's, of course, an interesting Star Wars connection. And I could see that, too, because Abin Sur was actually played by Tamu Morrison, who, was the Jango Fett, which obviously was the basis for the clone troopers. And, of course, Boba, is a clone of Jango. So it's kind of interesting how, it all kinds of seems to kind of sometimes kind of connect or line up. So I wouldn't be surprised, James, if it is more of an Abin Sur kind of nod than necessarily Grig from Last Starfighter. Although myself personally, when you consider the influence of Star Wars and then obviously how it obviously inspired, Last Starfighter, I think it'd be more personally interesting and rewarding for me if the character is a little bit more referential to Grig than necessarily Abin Sur. But I could see where Abin Sur also makes an interesting connection when you consider how Tamu Morrison plays into, obviously, Star Wars legacy.
Yeah, I could see that as well. So this is something that you're interested in, huh, Dave?
Yeah, it looks interesting to me. Like I said, I'm just curious how difficult it is to fly the X-Wing or the TIE Fighter. And wasn't there like a TIE Fighter simulation game that people used to be all excited about that was actually for the computer? I seem to remember people playing it on their computer.
There was a sequel to the X-Men simulator. So, not X-Men, X-Wing. Sorry about that. They both have X's. I got confused. The X-Wing simulator game came out first, and that came out for the IBM compatible computers. Back then it wasn't PCs, it was IBM compatible. And then they did a sequel for the TIE Fighters. And actually, we owned both of them. In fact, I think there's a box right next to me that actually has the original box version of the TIE Fighter simulator. But we had both of them, the X-Wing and the TIE Fighter one. And I really wish they would re-release those games remastered for consoles. I think that would be so much fun because those games were awesome. In fact, the way I remember it was that X-Wing game was really what took like Lucas Interactive to this huge level, because prior to that, Star Wars games were considered very mixed. To this day, licensed games, games that are developed, based on other properties, to this day they have a really bad rap, like a really, really bad rap, because most of them suck. And there's tons of criticism of a lot of these licensed games because they're sort of a cash grab, like we were talking about licensing earlier, and the lack of quality and oversight. So that they're kind of just a cash grab. But that X-Wing simulator, just totally changed things. And people were like, wow, Lucas Interactive is doing crazy stuff. And of course, like a decade or 2 decades later, they sold that division and got rid of it because apparently none of the studios want to make games. So, but yeah, that's kind of the history, I think, that people are forgetting, because people are saying this is a spiritual successor to Rogue Squadron, but it really goes all the way back to that X-Wing simulator and that TIE Fighter simulator as well.
Are you saying Masters of Terra Kasai was a crappy game?
I don't think I'm even familiar with that one.
Oh, no. So you didn't play Masters of Terra Kasai?
No, I can't say that I did. I'm not familiar with that one.
That was the Star Wars Mortal Kombat Street Fighter fighting game where you could have fun.
Oh, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah.
In fact, I was trying to get that because I wanted to have a complete collection of all the original PlayStation Star Wars games, and that's one of them, right? That's one of the games they have for the original PlayStation.
Yes, and it's a shame because if I'd known that, I would have just sent it to you because I sold it at a yard sale a couple years ago. So,
how much you get for it?
Not what it's worth. I think maybe a couple bucks. We're getting ready to do another yard sale actually here coming up, and people who pay any attention, they know that when I do yard sales, there's always good stuff out there because I used to eBay once upon a time, but now I don't have the patience to eBay, mostly because I hate going to the post office. I think some of our Rogues Gallery members are aware of how much I hate to go to the post office, but for a lot of reasons. But hopefully here pretty soon I'll have everything set up and the post office will just come to me instead of me having to go to them. I don't like going to them anymore. But anyhow, no, I think I just got a couple bucks for it because I didn't think there'd be much interest in it, to be honest. And then it was weird because then on Solo, I think they reference one of the characters in Solo is a master of Terrakasai, which I was like, oh yeah, it's like the video game. So
there you go. It all comes back together. Well, Dave, I do have one more pop culture news story.
Cool.
That I would like to share with you. I actually had wanted to talk about this last week because that's when this story originally came out. But we were totally going over time, so I thought I would talk about it this week because it's still actually pretty topical because this hasn't actually happened yet. So we've actually been talking about on the program doing a little bit more of Orville news. That we want to do more Orville stuff, but we're trying to wait on the timing because we haven't gotten an official announcement about Orville season 3 yet. But this is interesting here. This is actually from the Daily Star Trek News podcast, which I thought was interesting because a lot of times you see the Star Trek people don't always play nice with the Orville people. But this is actually from Daily Star Trek News.com, and it says flags from the Orville will soon be headed to the International Space Station. And it says the Orville is heading into space for real. At the end of May, Richard Gardner, director of the Space Collective Ltd., tweeted the announcement that some flags from Seth MacFarlane's hit Trek-alike show would be headed to the International Space Station. From the announcement, in September 2020, a very small handful of the Orville flags will launch into space aboard an Antares rocket stored inside of a Grumman Cygnus spacecraft at the top of the rocket. Then a few days after launch, the spacecraft will dock with the space station where it will orbit the Earth at 25 times the speed of sound over the course of 6 months. So they're actually going to send these Orville flags that I assume were actually used on the show into space. They will actually be on the International Space Station for a period of time. And then I guess they'll come down and some hardcore fans will have a chance to buy them. That's my assumption. Had you heard about this, Dave?
I think I had seen something like on Twitter or something where someone had been discussing this. I didn't read the news item or the news article just because you can just tell by the headline. It's just mostly just a publicity piece. And sometimes I don't read the publicity pieces. Other times I can't stay away from them. But no, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I know for the Orville, they're trying to get any press they can to keep people talking and excited because, the show's been on a long hiatus, whether, in production and trying to finish stuff up before they can hopefully launch the third season. But no, I hadn't heard this. I mean, I'm not, well, I mean, I guess I'm kind of surprised, but not too terribly surprised because, of course, even going back to the original, space shuttle missions and stuff, they were always kind of putting something kind of cool or interesting, on the space shuttle and sending it up into space and bringing it back down to Earth when I was a kid, back when the, NASA and the space program was like a big deal, at least in my mind. I mean, I know the recent was it SpaceX launch or whatever in conjunction with NASA. So, that was obviously a big deal. But that's been the first big, like really big in my mind anyway, space thing for like a little while. Was actually that. So, no, it's interesting. It's interesting.
I do want to clarify that the flags it says will not be for sale, but they are offering that Space Collective Ltd. Is offering the chance to purchase a personalized item that will go up on the same payload. You can choose from a custom name patch, a variety of small flags, or a small NASA pin, all of which will be flown in space before being checked out and shipped to you. So I guess the flags themselves, I don't know. I guess they're going back into Seth MacFarlane's collection, or maybe they'll be used on the show. That's kind of interesting too. So definitely this, I think you hit the nail on the head that this is being done for some publicity for the show. But I think it's a fun thing, especially for hardcore Orville fans.
Well, I think the really interesting thing would be if those flags were actually used in the show, like sort of like kind of like what they did with the episode with where they find the cell phone, the person who made the cell phone that was in a time capsule, where it's
that's a great episode.
like these flags are from this era and they were on the International Space Station because of this, and they kind of feature into a story because those of us actually watching it would get a big kick out of it, realizing that those flags were really on the International Space Station for real. Not just in the context of the show. That would be interesting. So,
yeah, that would be interesting. So, yeah, I don't know exactly what the reason is they're doing it. Like I said, like you kind of mentioned, I think it might be primarily for publicity. It certainly got us talking about it. So that if that was the intent, mission accomplished by the Orville.
Yep. You definitely managed to get our attention. So very cool. Do you have anything else for pop culture news, or are we ready to switch over to streaming wars?
I say we do streaming wars.
All right, cool. All right, so in the streaming wars segment, we talk about anything interesting happening in the world of the streaming wars. Now, by the streaming wars, we're obviously talking about all these various streaming services that exist, services I cannot talk tonight, all these amazing streaming services that exist. Whether you're talking about Hulu, you're talking about Peacock, if it ever shows up, the new HBO Max, which I don't think anyone's talking about. I know Apple had one. I don't remember what it's called anymore. Disney Plus, Netflix, all these amazing things. We have all these amazing options, all these amazing choices. A little bit of duplication on some of them, and then certain things are exclusive. Anyhow, enough about that. It's anything that we find interesting we want to share with you, that we hope that you might find interesting to discuss in relation to what's happening in the streaming wars. So tell me, Eric, what is the first story you have tonight for the streaming wars?
Well, I'm going to start out beating up on AT&T a little bit more. I thought this was interesting. I don't know if you had heard about this, Dave, but I thought this story was definitely right up your alley, and the stuff that we've been talking about with DC Universe and HBO Max, and I don't know what to call it. The infighting, the bad branding, I don't know what it is. So this is actually from DCComics.com. And this is what the headline of the article reads. It says, DC and HBO Max announce new original digital comic series. So we've got these covers here that we can see. It's called To the Max, and we can see these various characters. It's an HBO Max world premiere comic book event. So we've got 3 new comic book superheroes are taking it to the max in the brand new original digital comic book serials titled To the Max, published by DC in collaboration with HBO Max. To the Max features stories about ordinary people achieving their maximum potential while they transform into extraordinary superheroes with the help of another new character, Max the dog. The new comics also celebrate the recent launch of the new HBO Max and are chock full of Easter eggs and fun nods to much of the 10,000 hours of premium content currently available on the streaming platform, such as Friends, HBO's Game of Thrones, The Big Bang Theory, HBO's Sex and the City, Scooby-Doo, and more. Can you find them all? Free to download starting today, this initial launch of the digital comic includes 3 8-page chapters featuring everyday people, Hector, Brian, and Olivia, who meet Max the dog, gain access to different superpowers, and become able to teleport, shapeshift, fly, and save lives around the world. The comics embody the theme that HBO Max has something for everybody, and that everybody can be their own superhero and take themselves to the max. So I just thought that this was very interesting. It says that To the Max comics are available for free on digital retailers starting on June 15th. So that means that they're available now. I'm just really, really curious about your take on this story, Dave, and what you think of this.
Well, I was trying to find a picture of Max the dog, actually, while you were talking about this, and I couldn't find one. And I found all kinds of weird stories about some show or some dog show on HBO Max or some controversy or something about it. I don't know. I was just wanting to see what the dog looked like because I don't actually see Max the dog on any of these covers.
No, I
You
don't
told
either. That's
you
that's
you
pretty
told me that.
interesting when you.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, where's the friggin' dog? Shouldn't he be able to fly? Like, that's what I want to see. All right. So, before you said
Yeah, no,
Max the
where did you?
dog, I was yawning. That's my whole take on this. Um, and I shouldn't be so heavy-handed. I mean, I literally have hang actually above my studio. I can just glance up and see it. I have an original page of artwork from Atari Force, and of course, DC Comics produced the Atari Force comic book series in conjunction with Atari to help promote Atari. Of course, the Atari is one of the original, gaming home, gaming systems back in the day. So, these kind of things to me, they always depend upon um, who the creative teams are that's actually doing the books. And I'm not talking about the covers because they always get A-list talent for the covers. I'm talking to people that are actually doing all the heavy lifting on the interiors to actually bring this thing to life. These kind of productions, to me, that's what they're at the end of the day, they're always measured by. How entertaining is the story that's actually inside. So it's interesting. I mean, I had seen something about this before, but again, I've been so busy with so many different things, I hadn't spent a lot of time investigating it. What I want to know is if you can actually download these HBO Max comics for free on Comixology. So I'm pulling up Comixology right now. That's my main service I use to read free comics. I don't see it being promoted here. Let me do a quick search and just see. Can you actually get that? Actually, here on the there it is. It's not heavily promoted, but you can actually read this HBO Max digital series actually for free on Comixology. Okay, so just because of that, I'm putting them in my cart, and I will check them out. And next week, I will let you all know what I think about them.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Now, what I think is interesting is sort of the business marketing aspect of this, because you've talked a lot about. In fact, you predicted a long time ago that DC Universe would be like one of the first casualties of the streaming wars. And one of the things you actually praised, and you've praised numerous times about DC Universe, is all the comic book content. That you thought that was sort of a unique selling point. And I just think it's interesting what they're doing here, where I imagine these are available on DC Universe. It's hard for me to imagine they wouldn't be, especially if they're available on Comixology. But it just seems weird. And part of me is like thinking, are they kind of testing the waters here to see if they can move that comic content somewhere else and tie it in more directly to HBO Max? Because again, my angle is I feel like DC Universe and HBO Max are walking all over each other.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it feels like they are as well. And I don't know. It does feel like they're sort of, competing with themselves and not, I mean, the big thing with me that I sort of understand is, they always told us that when they did the New 52, that was all part of, at that time, the effort to take, basically DC Comics library of characters, those popular, valuable franchises, obviously not Superman and Batman, that were obviously, well-known household names, but a lot of the other characters that were not as well known, characters like Green Lantern, characters like hopefully like Booster Gold, The Question, all these other characters, and actually take them and integrate them across all these different things so that they could be, have a larger role in the movies and have a larger role in the TV shows and introduce these and also leverage them so that these characters could be used across all kinds of different opportunities within the totality of what they were, trying to do, as a company whole vision, to have it all be more connected. So the only thing with that this particular thing I find interesting, it's cool that DC Comics is producing these. I was looking at the interiors. The interiors look pretty good. So I'll definitely check
Did
it
you find
out.
the
I'll let
dog?
you all. Yeah, I did find the dog.
How's the
The
dog
dog,
look?
the dog is okay. The dog's not what I was expecting. But I guess the only thing is I'm curious to see like if the other DC heroes play a role in these stories. That's the thing. It's like, the Max the dog is an interesting connection, but why can't you have these heroes, meeting Superman or meeting Batman or meeting Wonder Woman? And how about the movie versions? Since we're going to have the Zack Snyder Justice League, on the HBO Max, like let's take this whole interconnectivity synergy thing. Let's just take it to the next level, but that's just me spitballing. Obviously, that's a horrible idea because I didn't do it. But no, I don't know. We'll see. I just that's the thing I'm always shocked at is like, well, I thought all this was to bring it together. So why aren't you able to access all this amazing content of the DC Universe app through HBO Max? Like, I don't understand why they're not. I mean, to me, because all of these stories start with the comics first, and then they proliferate out, and then you're looking at the movies and the TV shows and the cartoons and whatever that comes kind of after that. So I'm always surprised they don't make more of an effort to get people more vested, more interested, and introduced just into the comics themselves. I mean, I think the last major push, besides obviously something like this, but this is to more promote HBO Max than to get people into the comics, or again, Batman, Superman, whoever would be in these series too, as along with Max the dog, or Crypto. Maybe these people could have met Crypto the super dog. That would be kind of fun and interesting, and then he introduces them to this larger world, and they discover they have powers, and they team up with some of the DC heroes to take on some classic villains. But that's what I would have done. Obviously, that's a horribly bad idea, but that's what I would have done.
I think it's just. I think your ideas are fantastic, but I don't understand why they do things. Well, I shouldn't say I don't understand. I do understand a little bit of it, actually a lot of it because of stories you've told me. But to me, it almost feels like this is, since they're having all these weird issues right now, where they're having to rotate all the Time Warner DC related content. We talked about that last week. They're having to rotate it out. They can't keep it up there apparently, because they're sharing it with DC Universe. And it feels like the same thing is happening here, where it's like now HBO Max has started to dip its toe into the world of comics, digital comics, and rather than tie it in directly with DC Universe, and even with the regular DC characters, they just went ahead and created their own characters. They created all these new characters and said, okay, now we're going to have our own superheroes on HBO Max. In some ways, you wonder whether this is sort of like a very soft debut for like the HBO Max verse. Like before, we talked about the possibility of a Snyderverse, where basically they might actually do things like bring Ben Affleck back as Batman, and that would be completely separate from The Batman, the other film that's coming out, and it would just be on HBO Max. It would be an exclusive that might follow up on the Snyder Cut, which, by the way, I think is going to happen if the Snyder Cut is a massive success. The Snyder Cut is a massive success and brings in tons and tons of people to HBO Max. I think the Ben Affleck Batman suddenly becomes a real possibility. Same thing here is I feel like if these comics are popular, then HBO Max might offer some sort of a digital comic book option, but with their characters. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, but there already is an HBO comic book universe that they're doing in a show. It's called Watchmen.
Yeah, well, Watchmen is has very mixed reviews. I mean, I've heard some absolutely. I mean, I know that there are some very prominent YouTubers that absolutely hated that show. Absolutely hated it.
Well, and I meant that as kind of a joke, but it didn't work. But
well, this is streaming wars. This is a
segment here. But no, could it be? It's possible. I mean, I look at the success of Atari Force. Initially looking at these, I don't see these being anything more than just an initial tie-in thing. I mean, maybe there's some interesting concepts that they'll revisit, and maybe they'll continue to move beyond, just this initial sort of promotional thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously, if it's super popular, it could be the beginning of the introduction of an HBO Max superhero universe. That's possible. I wouldn't say no to that initially in terms of like someone thinking it's a good idea. I'm not sure I think it's a good idea. But
I definitely don't think it's a good idea. I think it's a terrible idea. I'm in the camp that says, why aren't they just doing something like you just said? Why do they need this Max dog? Why couldn't they have used crypto? Why are they introducing these new characters when they have all these other tie-ins that they could use, like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman? You know what I mean? Why am I not seeing those three on these covers right now? That's what I think is so strange about this story. And it's kind of a bigger story that we've been covering now ever since HBO Max started, which is like, what the hell is the CEO of AT&T doing? Are they just completely not invested in this stuff because they're too busy selling mobile phones? Like, somebody needs to start reining this stuff in. That's the angle I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, we'll just have to see what they do with this. I mean, to me, like I said, the thing to do would have been to have them introduced into the DC universe a little bit more, and then use this not only as an entryway and hopefully into obviously what HBO Max has, but to take that even further and try and get people to read more of the DC Comics material and get them more into the DC Comics library in general, through HBO Max. But that's just my personal opinion, what I would have probably done. I do want to shout out a Arizona connection real quick, though, because again, looking at these and reviewing the creative talent involved, Hi-Fi Color, which is based out of Arizona, Brian and Christy Miller, Hi-Fi actually did the color on these, so that's cool.
They also did the color for the cover of the primary cover for the Occupants tie-in comic book that I mentioned earlier in the program. So we've actually, both of us have actually worked with them before because they did the color for that as well. So that's good on them. Good on them.
Yeah, and they also colored too. In addition to that, some of my favorite comic book covers I've ever had the chance to work on was actually Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. Scott and I did a series of 8 classic superhero Legion of Superhero images. One of the coolest was actually the Legion in their classic costumes, standing on top of the what they used to call the Rocket Clubhouse, which was the Legion's original headquarters. And then they took that same artwork and they actually used that for the HeroClix packaging art. And Brian actually colored that. So that's really cool too.
That is cool. Very, very cool. Nice to have that kind of local connection as well. The Hi-Fi does good stuff, and they do a lot of, obviously, the big mainstream stuff with DC and Marvel. So they're kind of the top of the game, as it were,
Very cool. Yeah. And I just wanted to shout that out because I thought that was an interesting connection. So tell me, Eric, what else do you have for this episode's segment of the Streaming Wars?
All right. I think I've got one more here. Let me find the article. Okay, so this is the other streaming service I like to bash on right now. By the way, I just want to say I officially no longer am subscribed to CBS All Access. I just did not find it worth my money. So this is a Hollywood Reporter article, and it says, and this is dated on the 16th of this month, so just yesterday. It says, ViacomCBS CEO talks CBS All Access reboot to create, quote-unquote, super service. Says, quote, this really brings a lot of young audience to the table. Bob Backash told an investors conference about adding another 15,000 hours of CBS and Viacom content to the streaming service. Says ViacomCBS CEO Bob Backash detailed changes to CBS All Access, including 15,000 hours of new Viacom and CBS programming and sports content as he discussed a planned relaunch in 2021 of the streaming service on Tuesday. Quote, the second part of our strategy is to transform All Access into a super service. So as ViacomCBS dives deeper into the streaming space, including with other offerings like Pluto TV, which, by the way, I didn't realize Pluto TV was part of Viacom, and Showtime OTT. Planned changes to CBS All Access include new programming from Nickelodeon, MTV, Comedy Central, the Smithsonian Networks, and Paramount Network. It says Backish added his Hollywood studio would add another 15,000 hours of on-demand TV and film content to All Access, on top of the 15,000 hours of content already on the streaming service. It says we have a good position in the older segment with the current All Access product, but this really brings a lot of young audience to the table. Now, my big question here is, wasn't Star Trek supposed to do that, Dave?
Well, I was just going to say that the Smithsonian content's going to bring the younger viewers to this super service. You want to know what would make this a super service, in my humble opinion? Would be if they fix that stupid thing I have on my Samsung TV where it starts to play a commercial and it causes a weird skipping, jumping thing, and it goes from the episode I'm watching to the next episode without warning me at all what in the hell it's doing. I have been trying to send an email using their quote-unquote support email to let them know that there's this problem on the Samsung television, and of course it doesn't go through because I guess that email doesn't really work. That would make it a great super service, in my opinion, would be to fix that really friggin' annoying problem, because I still am a CBS All Access subscriber. But every time it does that, I question why I am still a CBS All Access subscriber.
And I question that as well, Dave. I mean, I'll question. It's not rhetorical. Why are you still a CBS All Access subscriber? Please tell us.
Oh, I don't know. I guess I'm waiting for all this young, hip content like the Smithsonian Channel.
But you didn't really answer my question, Dave. Wasn't Star Trek, wasn't New Trek? I call it New Trek. I call anything from CBS All Access, I call it New Trek. That's Discovery, Short Treks, and Picard. And I call it New Trek. And I'm like, wasn't New Trek supposed to bring in all these young people? Wasn't that the whole plan?
Yeah, that was my understanding. I mean, that's part of what it was supposed to do. But you know, apparently that's for people that's for older people. Apparently, that's the stuff for the old people. The Smithsonian Channel, that's what's going to bring in the kids.
Well, they love that science, right? You know, that's, you know, yay science. You know, as long as, you know, they agree with it. But anyway, I think that this shows Viacom, on the one hand, is doing a no-brainer, okay? It makes sense that now that Viacom and CBS are together, it does make sense to actually bring the Smithsonian Channel involved if that's something that they have access to, because CBS didn't have access to that before because for whatever reason, Viacom and CBS completely bucked the trend that everybody else was doing, and they separated, which was kind of a disaster, especially for Viacom. CBS was actually doing pretty well, but Viacom was losing all sorts of money, which is Paramount Studios. They were losing all sorts of money, having all sorts of problems, you know, to the point that they were having to license things like Star Trek because they didn't have the rights to it anymore. CBS All Access did. It was a big mess. So they put them back together. And in doing so, yes, they can do things like Nickelodeon, you know, the Smithsonian Channel. I listed some other ones that they were talking about here. And it makes absolute sense to put them all together on one service rather than doing, say, what HBO Max is doing and DC Universe is doing, where they're fighting over their own content when they aren't even different companies. They're both under AT&T. But the spin on this article is what's interesting to me, is this idea that, oh, well, we're doing this because we want to get all this, you know, because we're doing good with the older fans, which I don't believe that, but they say they are. And it says, but we want to get the new fans. Again, I just have to ask it again. Wasn't New Trek supposed to take care of this problem? Wasn't New Trek supposed to bring in all these young people?
Yeah, I mean, it was supposed to, but obviously that's not what's really happening, because clearly, that this head of the studio here clearly is thinking that it's not working, and we're gonna do something different, because it's not working. And then Man of Stan has a comment. He says, "Isn't Star Trek Picard still slated for production of further seasons?" Yes, as far as we all know, it is slated for episodes of further season. And of course, Star Trek Picard, that brought all the kids in, didn't it? The assistant
apparently
thing that really brought the kids in.
Yeah, it's weird. And by the way, Manisan, great to have you comment on the show. You always give great comments and great questions and stuff like that. Yeah, officially, Star Trek Picard is absolutely still slated for a second season. But there has been no announced production date. Now, in the post or current pandemic world, however you view it, there's obviously issues with production right now. We were talking about the Orville earlier. Orville season 3 has obviously been on a hiatus, and we have no indication of when they're going to start up again. And they were actually filming. They were in the middle of filming and then stopped. Star Trek Picard season 2 hasn't done anything. As far as I've heard, they haven't even started doing storyboarding. They don't even know what the heck they're going to do for season 2. But officially, it's still out there. But stuff like this makes me wonder. It really makes me wonder. I don't have any inside source other than the comments that we're getting from the head of ViacomCBS, the actual boss, where he's saying, hey, we're going to add all this content. We're going to rebrand and redo CBS All Access as ViacomCBS All Access, make it a super service, and we're going to get those young people. I thought Picard and Discovery and Short Treks were supposed to do that. So I don't get it. I should say I don't get it. Reading between the lines, I'm trying to say New Trek is a terrible, terrible failure. And CBS All Access is not giving us the real numbers of just how much of a failure they are.
Well, and I'm on the record, that like I said, I liked Discovery. There's a lot of stuff about a lot of aspects of Discovery that I quite enjoyed. So that's for me personally. But I'm obviously not a young kid, so I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like, this all just sounds like a bunch of hype and a bunch of spin. The idea that they're going to, rebrand and somehow bring in a bunch of people, which we've all heard and seen that before. And I don't know. I don't, like I said, it's like if they want to really offer a super service, adding this additional content sounds great. I'm always for more new content. I don't know. We'll just have to see. It always drives me nuts, this constant concern and preoccupation with, we got to get the kids. It's like, well, what about the rest of us? I
don't think they have the rest of us. I don't think they have the rest of us either. I think it's just a complete, like you said, like the Smithsonian Channel, that's going to bring in all the young people or something like that. I'm not really buying that. I think that they're in trouble on both sides, and they just decided to spin a no-brainer decision, because this is a no-brainer decision. This is not as complicated as HBO Max and DC Universe are making it. It makes sense to put all this content together. I think that's a no-brainer. What I think is interesting is the spin on this story from the CEO. This is straight out of his mouth of what he's saying, why he's doing this. It's like, to me, I would have been like, this is a no-brainer. We're back together. We're going to put all the content together. We're going to play nice because we're one big happy family. We're going to kick ass. And that's all I would have said. You know what I mean? I wouldn't have said anything else, because this spin makes me think that the new Trek is not as successful as they have made it out.
Yeah, I could see that. That's it. I could totally see that, especially with this announcement, the way that it's, sort of worded. Obviously you want your headline to lean into your strengths, when you're announcing something. But yeah, I kind of take offense to the idea. It's like we're gonna make a super service. It's like the service I have isn't super. I mean, I know it's
No,
not
it's
super.
not.
You
You
know,
know it's
but
not. We both know it's not. That's why I don't have it anymore, and that's why you can't get anybody to answer emails back.
yeah. And I have been enjoying the Good Fight. My wife and I have been slowly making our way through the Good Fight, actually on All Access. So we've been kind of enjoying that show. But no, yeah, I mean, I don't know. This all just sounds like spin. Obviously, adding new content is nice, but at the end of the day, it's going to depend upon how they target and what it is they're trying to achieve, whether or not they're going to be able to see the real success, on the numbers side. And it's weird because there's a lot of content on CBS All Access that basically you can watch for free. So, why would people feel incumbent, or driven to necessarily even get the service if they hear there's mixed reviews on it? And then there's an awful lot of content they can just run over and watch for free. So I don't know.
Well, that's the model that the Peacock is going to be starting next month, right? Or is it later this month? Peacock is going to be unveiling their ad-based service very soon, very, very soon.
Well, I'm sure that'll be interesting, but we'll have to wait. We'll have to wait and see what happens, and see by them if this, Viacom, CBS, I don't know, All Access, whatever the heck they're going to call it, if that's up and running, and then if we want, we can compare apples to apples, as they say, or apples to oranges, depending upon how well the service does or it does not work, and sort of lead up to, or to people's imaginations, because that at the end of the day, that's the big thing. You have to win the people over so that they'll try your service, so they'll take a look at what you're doing. If you're going to have any success of converting anyone into any kind of a sale, provided that that's important for you and your bills and such on and so forth.
By the way, I was just trying to look and see if I had missed what they were going to call it, and I don't see it. I'm guessing it's just going to be called ViacomCBS All Access, because the official name of the company now is ViacomCBS. So that would be my guess. Could be wrong.
Yeah, for me, that would make sort of the most most sense, but I don't know.
They don't always do what makes sense.
No, they do not.
Sure.
All right, cool. Do you have anything else for Streaming Wars?
No, that was it. I just said the two.
All right, cool. Are we good to go ahead and set up our retro review topic for this evening?
Sounds good to me.
All right, very cool. So on tonight's episode for the Rogues Retrospective Review, we're going to be talking about, from 1984, the classic, in my mind, the classic action sci-fi adventure film, The Terminator. So here, just real quickly, The Terminator came out on October 26, 1984. It's directed by James Cameron. I'll read the synopsis here from the Almighty Google here just real quickly. It says, disguised as a human, a cyborg assassin known as the Terminator, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, travels from the year 2029 to 1984 to kill Sarah Connor, who's played by Linda Hamilton. Sent to protect Sarah is Kyle Reese, played by Michael Biehn, who divulges the coming of Skynet, an artificial intelligence system that will spark a nuclear holocaust. Sarah is targeted because Skynet knows that her unborn son will lead the fight against them. With the virtually unstoppable Terminator in hot pursuit, she and Kyle attempt to escape. So in order to do a retrospective review, we want to start off with is we want to talk about how we originally heard about the film or actually became aware of it, and then talk about our initial impressions. And then we'll obviously talk about how we feel about the film today, having actually recently rewatched it. So tell me, Eric, how did you first hear about The Terminator?
So I have a kind of interesting story about my first experience with The Terminator that's actually a very vivid memory in my head. I don't quite remember what year. I know I didn't see this film in the movie theater. I was not allowed to watch rated R movies when this film came out. I was quite young, and I wasn't really supposed to be watching rated R films until I was I think almost a teenager, or at least like junior high type of age. So years and years ago, when I was growing up, I used to spend a lot of summers in Guadalajara, Mexico, because I have a lot of family in Guadalajara, Mexico. I have uncles, aunts, cousins, you name it. Got a lot of family over there. My mom's side of the family, most of them live there. They live in Guadalajara. So I used to go there quite often for summers as I was growing up. And usually I would stay with my grandmother. But every once in a while, I would actually stay with one of my uncles. And I have an uncle that actually was pretty well off. And I used to stay at his house with his sons, my cousins. They were my first cousins. And we used to have a lot of fun. And one of the things that we did that was kind of interesting for me is we went out to a local video store and we rented some movies one night. And at this time, I can't remember if we even had a VCR at my house, because I was one of those families where we were like one of the last people to get a VCR, and we didn't have VHS. We actually had Beta when we got our first video cassette machine. So in Mexico, I had this uncle who again was pretty well off. They had a VCR, and my cousins took us to their local equivalent of Blockbuster. Although I think those back in those days, United States and Mexico, I think most of these places were independently owned. They were owned by regular people. We went to their local video store, and this was one of the movies that we rented, which I don't think I was really supposed to be seeing at the time. I was quite young. It was obviously out of the movie theater. At that time, it took quite a while for films to come out on video cassette after they've been released in the movie theater. So it was definitely years after it had been released, and I got to watch it, at my uncle's house. And it was quite an experience for me because, like I said, at that point in time, I don't think I was even supposed to be watching rated R movies. And this movie, of course, has a ton of violence. It has nudity. It has all sorts of stuff, exactly the type of stuff my parents didn't want me to see. But hey, my cousins hooked me up. So that's how I saw Terminator. What about you, Dave?
Well, my first memory of the Terminator was actually seeing it on television. Not actually on VHS. It wasn't the R-rated version. It was a cut-down TV version. And then many years later, I remember seeing it on VHS. One of my most fond memories, actually, of the Terminator, and just to be clear, I just found the Terminator on one day while I was flipping channels. It wasn't like someone had told me about it or I had already heard about it. It was just on television, kind of the same way that I discovered Dune. It was just kind of on. So what's interesting, or my most vivid memory of the Terminator from like back in the day was in high school, I had been elected the president of the science club. And I thought it'd be interesting to introduce sort of like careers and different things that you could have kind of through science. And so I thought makeup effects and stuff would be really interesting. So I made arrangements to actually have someone come in who actually did makeup effects for a living to actually talk to our science club class about how he uses actually, science in order to create makeup effects for movies and such on and so forth. And I thought it'd be really interesting to have the Terminator be the film that we actually showed, because this would have obviously been after school. But it was really interesting because we actually watched the VHS version of the Terminator. They just wanted me to skip over or somehow not have us watch the sex scenes. Other than that, they didn't care, which I always thought was really funny. And then I couldn't figure out a better way to do it, so we just fast forwarded through the sex scenes. So kind of saw them. So kind of shocked I was able to get away with actually, watching Terminator at science club in high school. But it was interesting. And I've always liked the Terminator film ever since I originally saw it back in the day. And to me, it's one of those classics, at least in my mind anyway. It's one of those just classic science fiction films. It's kind of cool. I noticed back then, and obviously you noticed today, acknowledgement, to the works of Harlan Ellison, because the Terminator does lean on a lot of classic science fiction stories that had been around. It just puts them together in a slightly different way and repackages them. in a way that at times is more compelling and maybe a little bit more exciting. But I did think it was neat. I remember even back then, I thought it was really cool that they acknowledged, the original stories that this is obviously borrowing from.
This is the first time I noticed that. I didn't notice that before. And it's interesting because I think the only reason I did notice it this time is because of the previous review that we did on the City on the Edge of Forever comic adaptation of his original screenplay.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was really neat. I just remember even back in the day, the fact that they actually took the time to acknowledge, Harlan Ellison's, contributions, to the film. I always love seeing that kind of attribution, in a film or a TV show or whatever, created by or whatever. I always thought that was really kind of cool and interesting.
I wonder if today you could do that kind of credit. It seems to me that if you did that kind of credit today, you would get some sort of lawsuit. Because as far as I know, I don't know of Ellison doing any kind of lawsuit against Terminator. But I feel like today you might not be able to get away with something like that because they were basically crediting him as an inspiration, which you don't see that very much anymore, and I think that's for legal reasons.
No, I could see that. So in order for it to be a retrospective, obviously we have to talk about how we first heard about the film, how we felt about it then. And then we want to talk about how we feel about the film today and discuss our recent experiences actually reviewing it, obviously here for the show. So with the Terminator, what's interesting is I actually watched this actually as a part of my Amazon Prime subscription. And the only reason I watched on Amazon Prime, because I do own it on DVD, is because a few days prior to watching the Terminator, I had actually had Stargate on, and the original movie with Kurt Russell and James Spader. And the thing that was kind of disheartening was that my DVD is so old that transfer is awful. It's like trash. So I actually watched a little bit of Stargate opening sequences and such, actually on Amazon Prime to see if they had, a better transfer or a better version of it, and to see how much of a difference it made. And it made quite a difference. And so when it came time for me to watch Terminator for the film, watch the film actually for the show tonight, I thought, well, let me just go ahead and watch on Amazon Prime and see if they have like a newer, later transfer, because my DVD is kind of old. So, Chris, I watched it on Amazon Prime. That's how I watched it. And in my mind, the film still holds up. I mean, there's some pretty dated kind of effect shots here and there. And even though I consider this film a classic, you can definitely, quote unquote, see the man behind the curtain in some of the shots. While, they worked really good for television, the original way I saw it, seeing them as they continue to transfer and update these films, to the newer medias, the sort of unfortunate, we ran out of money, we still got to get this shot in, sort of nature of some of the effects. That's not true. I think at the time the effects were definitely state of the art.
They were cutting edge at the time. They were absolutely cutting edge at the time.
But I do know too that they were on a little bit of a budget with this one. The next one, they definitely had more resources, and I think some of the shots actually just kind of suffer a little bit from the fact that maybe they didn't have the kind of budget to pour into this that maybe they would have liked. But it's still a very good looking film, and I do feel like it's very, very much a classic, an 80s classic, and definitely sort of not just time travel, but just truly a great science fiction classic film from top to bottom. But I would just say there's definitely some spots, some effect shots that have definitely not aged very well. But other than that, I found the film to be very rewatchable. It's a lot of fun. That classic scene still kind of cracks me up where the Terminator shows up. Spoiler alert. The Terminator shows up at the police station and he's talking to the guy who's kind of checking people in. And he kind of looks around. He's like, I'll be back. And then he drives his car right through the front of the police station. That's still such a kind of a fun, I always get a snicker out of that.
I think people although I don't think there's many people that haven't seen this film, I think people, if there are any, they still know that scene because that line is used by Arnold Schwarzenegger in almost every film he's in. You know what I mean? The I'll be back. It's his catchphrase.
And this is the film that started it.
Right.
No, yeah, it's still a very fun and watchable film. I did find it, because I know that Arnold walks to the police station and kills a bunch of the cops, as a part of the story. I did find some of this to be a little bit more, not really shocking because I knew it was happening, but I did find myself having a different resonance to it and responding to it in a different manner than when I was younger. When I was younger, you're just enjoying watching the Terminator tear through people. But with everything going on in the world today, it takes on kind of a different context when you're watching what's happening. At least that was my personal experience. But I would definitely say upon revisiting the Terminator, this is a film I watch, again, every couple years. And by watch, I mean it's actually on in the studio while I'm working. Sometimes I'm not paying super focused, laser gun sight attention, to it while it's on. It's just kind of on and I'm listening to it. But I do, like I said, consider this to be a science fiction classic. So tell me, Eric, having recently rewatched it for the show here, how do you feel about the Terminator?
I think my experience is very similar to yours. I myself also own the DVD version of this film. And it's actually a great addition because it has a lot of deleted scenes in the DVD version that I have. And I watch this film, from time to time, quite often as well. But for the show, first of all, I hadn't watched it in, I don't know, several months. It's been a while since I've watched it, even though I do own it. And I decided to watch it on YouTube because right now this film is available on YouTube with ads for free. So I thought that was interesting because I haven't really watched like an official movie on YouTube before, I don't think. I may have watched some pirated stuff on there before because I couldn't find it anywhere else, which, by the way, I don't advise people to do that, but because, that's not nice. But I have done it. But this one is officially licensed on YouTube right now to watch for free with ads. And what's nice about that is that it's free, don't have to pay anything. And like any other YouTube video, you can skip through the ads after the first 5 seconds, which is in huge contrast to services like Crackle, Pluto TV, other services that we've talked about on the show, which, by the way, we do advocate for. We do advocate support of Pluto TV, of Crackle, of Tubi, because these are ad-based services and they're free. And so we've tried to highlight them and their content on this show. But YouTube kind of takes it a step further in terms of enjoyment because you only have to watch about 5 seconds of the ad and then you can skip through it. So I thought that was interesting in terms of my experience in watching it today as someone who does watch the film quite often. But there's so many points I agree with you, Dave. I think you just hit the nail on the head. Specifically with the dated effects. First of all, I think the effects are actually superb in this movie, except in the last act. There are 3 defined acts in this movie. There's sort of the beginning where they're all kind of separated, and we have to get them together, and that's the first act. The second act is basically almost completely entirely that massacre in the police station, which I completely agree with you as someone who was a police officer for 20 years, that scene takes on a very different resonance today, in the contemporary world that we're in and how things are going right now in the world. There's a sort of third act that begins, as they're on the run. After Reese has his last flashback. And that's one thing you didn't mention, Dave, was those flashback scenes. I think those flashback scenes are superb. I think they are done extremely well and totally stand up to today's standards of special effects. And the reason is because they are basically practical effects. And they were done with, like models, and they were done with set pieces. There's that iconic image, I can never get out of my head, of when it's that last flashback that Reese has where we get to see the living conditions of the typical human beings in this world, in the future world, which, by the way, always fascinated me. I was always wanting to know more about this future world. And it's so funny because we've had so many Terminator films, many of them of very poor quality, in my opinion. But we've had so many Terminator films, we've never gotten another focus on that future world as it was shown in this movie. And I think there's a lot of fans like myself that are still thirsting for that. And there's that iconic scene when we show the living conditions of the typical humans where they seem to be watching TV. Do you remember that moment, Dave?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I had a conversation. My wife actually quite likes the Terminator films. And we had a conversation about the fact that we feel like, as just you had just pointed out, and I totally agree, it's definitely in my opinion, I feel like that there are a lot of Terminator fans that, for example, went to Terminator Salvation hoping to get that experience, getting to, spend time in sort of Kyle Reese's and John Connor's world. That version of the future that we're shown, in glimpses here in Terminator and showed a little bit more of in Terminator 2. And that's the version of the future that everyone wants to see. Everyone wants to, I think a lot of Terminator fans would love to see a story set in that time, whether it sets up.
I want to see them with the plasma rifle in the 40-watt range. What
exactly.
I mean? I want the plasma rifle. Because that's one of the big things with Terminator Salvation that I think was disappointing was, they're using contemporary weapons and things like that. And people are kind of like, I get it. Because Terminator Salvation was supposed to lead to another trilogy. I mean, that was the original intent. It just didn't work out. It didn't happen. And so they were trying to set up the story, obviously, and they were trying to show sort of the beginning of the resistance, which doesn't really coincide much with the original film version, at least in my mind. It seems different. But then again, I guess it would be different because of the events of Terminator 2. But still, we've never really got to see that future world. And I just want to emphasize that I think those effects are superb. Where it falls is in the third act. In the third act, when they're being chased by the Terminator for the final conclusion, there's several scenes specifically where they're using stop motion. And the stop motion actually works pretty well because the Terminator is supposed to be injured. He's actually lost all of his skin, and now it's just the skeleton, essentially, of the Terminator, and he's badly damaged. And so they did that in stop motion. It's very obvious that they did that in stop motion. Where it falls short is those scenes where they have the human actors and the stop motion together. Those are the ones I think that are the glaring kind of effect shots where you're like, wow, that's really dated. But what I thought was interesting about that is obviously that was done with that sort of back screen technique. They obviously combined two special effects processes, one being the stop motion to actually make the Terminator walk, because they didn't have an actual animatronic Terminator that could walk. So they did some sort of stop motion with that. But then they used that back screen, that very old technology, which we've talked about in The Mandalorian, has been updated. And I couldn't help but think when I was watching that, like, what if they had the back screen technology, like they have now with The Mandalorian, and could have done that scene with, a stop motion Terminator, with the actors? I wonder if that would have worked, because obviously in The Mandalorian, they use that technology almost exclusively, as far as I could see, for a background. And I'm wondering, what if you tried to combine those two things together? That's always what I kind of think about, like a lot of these classic films could really use some sort of an update. You know what I mean? Where if they could use some of the technology we have today to kind of clean up a couple things. But then that gets into the whole argument of like what George Lucas did with his remastered Star Wars films and how a lot of people hate them. You know what I mean? So it is kind of a controversial subject, but I think that's the main special effects scenes that I saw that kind of take you out of it a little bit. But what's great about this movie is once all of that is over, the ending scene to me is so powerful and so emotional to me. And actually, to me, it's philosophically profound, the very last scene of this movie. that it really puts it all back together. And so watching it today, I definitely still have a great experience watching this movie, and it is definitely a classic, a well-earned classic. Manasan had a comment where he was saying, we've already seen crossovers like Alien versus Predator. I wonder if Terminator will ever be added to that mix. The original had a strong tech noir feel, and the T2 sequel was an over-the-top action hit. And Manasan, I think I agree with you there. There is a difference in tone between the original Terminator and Terminator 2, specifically a lot with that last scene, although the last scene of Terminator 2 has its own little philosophical message as well. I really liked what they did at the end of the original Terminator, as you say, that sort of tech noir. But as far as like a crossover, you know what came up in my head, which I think this seems a little bit obvious, but I've never heard anybody say this, but Reese was also in Aliens, right? I would kind of like to see the Colonial Marines take on a Terminator. What about you, Dave? What do you think of a crossover?
Well, I think a crossover makes a lot of sense. For me, the crossover I think should happen is actually the crossing over RoboCop with the Terminator. Not because of the Mortal Kombat video game per se, but more so because Dark Horse actually back in the day they actually published a really fun comic book series that basically was RoboCop versus the Terminator. I think that's, for me personally, that's what I would like to see explored. If they were,
that's a natural matchup. That's a natural matchup. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids and stuff like that, growing up, that's just a natural matchup. Who would win in a fight, the Terminator or RoboCop? You know what I mean? They're both cyborgs. Right. But you know what I always thought was interesting is they're reverse cyborgs of each other, right? Because RoboCop starts, his basis is the biological components. He's got a human brain. The Terminator cyborg is completely reversed, where we're looking at a computer brain with human skin and human organic compounds and a artificial skeleton. So I always thought that was fascinating too, that they're both cyborgs, but they're mirror images of each other in every way.
Right. No. Yeah. And to me, that's just the crossover I would most like to see. It's the one, like you said, that makes the most sense. Again, in my opinion. No. Yeah. I mean, I've just always felt like that's if you're going to cross it over, I could see that. But again, the Terminator, because of how interconnected everything is, and through Michael Biehn, I mean, you could do some kind of a Terminator Alien, sort of a thing.
Let's see Reese with all his fancy gadgets and stuff taking on the Terminator instead of a sawed-off shotgun. You know what I mean? And some homemade plastique. You know what I mean? Let's give him an upgrade. You know what I mean? That would be kind of fun.
Right.
And obviously, like I said, he was in Aliens, which is one of my favorite movies. That's another one that I own. And as I mention on the show all the time, if I own something, that's really personal high praise for me, because I really don't have a huge collection of DVDs or Blu-rays. I have a fairly modest collection of movies. And so if I own it, it's either something that somebody gave me or I found at a yard sale, which means it's like practically worthless to me, or it's something I really, really appreciate.
No, yeah. I mean, I could definitely see that. And then we actually have a comment actually from Jane. She said, and she's referencing Dave, after Terminator Universal experience changed the way you felt watching. So you're asking, let me rephrase this just a little bit. My mom is basically asking if after watching and experiencing the Terminator Universal experience, which was actually at the Universal Studios as a part of the tour, did it change the way I felt watching the movie? Well, watching this particular movie, I'm going to say no. It does, however, affect how I feel about not just watching Terminator 2, but actually the films that actually come after. Like, for example, like Rise of the Machines, the Terminator experience at Universal always felt like it was in direct conflict with Rise of the Machines, based off of what we know supposedly causes, the AI to become self-aware and and what they show us kind of at the Universal experience. But getting back to the original Terminator, I mean, to be honest, I don't have much more to say other than just that this film is it's just a classic. And I love the ideas of the crossover. Of course, what my mom's referencing, which is the Terminator experience at Universal. I don't even know if that still exists or not. But if it does, for me, it's still one of the coolest things because it ties in so closely with Terminator 2. And those are the things I find as the most interesting sort of extension of the film. Because, James Cameron was involved. It's considered a direct sequel. Obviously, we have Arnold. We have a lot of the actors from T2 kind of reprising their roles. And it very much, brings a new element, a new dimension to the story. And feels most the quote unquote, in my mind anyway, sort of in canon. For those of us that are big, canon aficionados in terms of, legacy of the characters in the story and moving it forward. But no, and tell me, Eric, did you ever get a chance to go to Universal Studios and do the Terminator experience? Are you familiar with what we're talking about at all?
I'm familiar with it, but no, I never went to Universal when they had it. I've been to Universal Studios in LA and also in Florida, but I don't think this attraction was actually a thing when I went. I was too little.
Oh, okay. It was really cool. I don't even know if it still exists anymore or not, but it was really, really fun. At least for those of us that are fans of the Terminator, because you kind of stood in line to go inside Cyberdyne Systems. And then the main hall where the experience takes place, it's like it's a part of this, again, just Cyberdyne in general. And then these Terminators come out of the floor and they battled each other and stuff and everything. It was really pretty cool. But
was there anything without? I'm just curious. You don't have to give a spoiler or anything, especially because we don't know if the attraction is still open. But did it seem to contradict something in the movie?
Not really. I mean, it ties into Terminator 2 pretty heavily. I mean, it's very much an extension, actually, of Terminator 2. I was always surprised as all these other sequels and everything's come out. They've never made more of an effort to take that and make that a little bit more, quote unquote, in continuity where more people can experience it. Just because that whole thing was put together by James Cameron. You know what I mean? And it's very much his vision, and it does very much continue it very much continues the version of the Terminator I think most of us, love the most, that we want to see more of. So, but no, it's pretty cool.
It's funny you say that because obviously pretty much all the Terminator movies have featured Arnold Schwarzenegger. Technically, even Salvation did in a cameo where they used his image and stuff like that. Although, he wasn't actually in the movie. They just basically like CGI'd him into the movie. But there's always sort of this focus on the Terminator. Watching this movie, because I was talking about how much I love those future scenes and how much I really want to see a movie about that. And I feel like, man, why didn't they ever make like a Reese movie? Why does it always have to be about the Sarah Connor or her son or John Connor? Why couldn't they have made a Reese movie? Like, for instance, there's a scene in this movie, I was talking about it earlier, where we get to see how the humans live in that dystopian world, and they are attacked by a Terminator. And we never get to see what happened, how Reese actually obviously survived that encounter, because it almost looks like he gets blown up. But obviously he didn't. He's got scars all over his body. We can see that because he's naked, and the first time we see him in this movie, he's very scarred, very battered, obviously physically and emotionally. But I kind of would love, it's funny because there's been so many Terminator movies. It's like, why not do a Reese movie about him in the future fighting these Terminators? I think that would have been cool. Missed opportunity, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would have to say I would agree with that. And as I said before, too, I mean, for me, those scenes hold up incredibly well. They're a lot of fun. One of the most iconic moments, actually, from any of the Terminator films, which I think they actually borrowed for the marketing, actually, for Terminator 2, actually happens in that same scene you're describing. There's a Terminator, and he's kind of like walking down sort of this hallway of this area where people are congregating that are trying to survive, and you have some soldiers that are there, and he's wiping everyone out, and all you see is his glowing red eyes, and he's got the laser minigun or whatever it is, and he's blowing people away. That's such an iconic, in my mind anyway, visual. And then it's a visual that, again, for the marketing for T2 they tapped into, and actually for the Dark Horse comic books they actually tap into that iconography and use that for a couple covers kind of here and there over the run of the comic book series. But no, yeah, I mean, to me that makes the most sense. I think that's the thing most people would have liked. And I don't hate Salvation. I own Terminator Salvation. But that's part of the whole missed opportunity of Terminator Salvation. And it gets even more confused when you look at the Sarah Connor Chronicles, which was the television series, where they're trying to give us more information about John. They're trying to give us more information about Kyle. But when you watch Terminator Salvation, it's like Kyle's too old. And then when you watch Terminator Salvation, he seems like maybe he's too young, even though he would have been younger because he talks about surviving and scavenging in the streets, So I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like I think the obvious thing to do that people would love, for whatever reason, always escapes the filmmakers and their imagination when they're trying to think of things to do with this particular franchise.
Well, I think one of the problems, and you kind of touched it a little bit, is because of the time paradox issue. So for any of you folks out there that are hardcore sci-fi fans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And there's less of that issue in this movie. There's obviously one big one that's clearly a paradox and is weird. But it's kind of, also interesting. When I was watching this, I was thinking of like how Endgame treats time travel versus how the Terminator and Back to the Future treat time travel. And I was thinking in my head, if I were to reboot this, first of all, I would like to do the Reese thing. But I think I would also say, you know what? All these different Terminator movies you saw, they're all real. This whole time travel gimmick, it's just BS. Because basically every time they do this, they're going to a different parallel universe, and they're not affecting the events of their own universe at all, because it would be more of that Endgame version of time travel. I actually think that would be an interesting way to revamp the series if they ever chose to, which I think they will at some point. The Terminator never dies. Terminator never dies.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting idea, and something I think is worth exploring, And, the Terminator is one of those franchises that, despite all the films that have been made and the people that are loyal to it, that love it, it's not such a sacred cow, quote unquote, that you couldn't get away with, kind of attempting to pick up and move the story forward, as long as you do it in a respectful manner. You know what I mean? And I think for most people anyway, find a way to play homage, to the original film, But no, yeah. But again, just to sum up real quick, I would definitely say the Terminator is worth, rewatching if you haven't seen in a little while. It's definitely worth, getting back into this universe and this world. And, this film's got a lot of fun, performances in it given by all the leads. And it's just a really fun movie. It's just a fun, and the Terminator time actually comes across as sort of like a serial killer. And it's kind of an interesting, weird sort of like sci-fi serial killer sort of story at the same time. So, but it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I highly recommend people check out the Terminator. So tell me, Eric, would you feel the same way? You think for those people who haven't seen it, or maybe haven't seen it in a little while, that it's definitely worth taking the time and revisiting the Terminator?
Well, I will say that if you don't like violence, if you don't like, there's not a ton of nudity, but there is nudity and things like that. If you're not into those things, you're probably not going to like this movie. But I absolutely believe it is a classic. It's a classic in a lot of ways because In some ways, it crosses genre. I think most people think of this as a science fiction film, but in a lot of ways, this is a horror film as well, especially actually in the last act. And I do think it's kind of interesting because the three acts to me are very defined in my head of this movie, and there's some differences in tone and things that are going on with the characters. In a lot of ways, that last act it becomes sort of a horror movie. The world literally seems to become smaller, and suddenly the rest of the city doesn't seem to exist. Literally, it just has that sort of complete change in tone in the last act. So again, I think it's a classic. I definitely would recommend it. But if you're not into violence and gore, and you're not quite into the whole nudity and sex thing, might not be for you.
I could see that. Do we think that's good, or do you have anything else you want to add on the Terminator?
No, I think the one thing I would mention is obviously some people out there may never have seen the original, and they may have seen some of the other films and not like them. I do think Terminator 2 holds up very well to this film. I do not hate Terminator Salvation. I think there are some good things about that film. I actually like, what's the third one, Dave? Is that Rise of the Machines? Is that the third one?
Yeah, that's Rise of the Machines.
So I thought Rise of the Machines was actually pretty decent because I liked what they did about explaining what Skynet actually was and what happened. I thought it was a really good twist. So there are elements that I like, but I know there's people that hate a lot of these movies. And so if you're one of those people that maybe you've only seen Terminator 3 or you've only seen, 4 or, God Help You, Genesis or the last one, and that's the only one you've seen, and so you've never checked out the original, give the original a try because the original, I think, is arguably the best, although there could be an argument there with Terminator 2 for sure.
Yeah, I would definitely have to say I totally wholeheartedly agree with Eric's assessment. I think this film is definitely worth revisiting, and especially right now too. Like if you can watch it on YouTube for free, why not? Go give it a try and check it out if you haven't seen it. And then number two, if it's been a little while since you have seen it, that's a fun way to see it again and get back into the world of the Terminator. So,
right on, absolutely.
Yeah. Is that good? Are we good to go to the outro, you think?
Yes.
All right, very cool. All right, so I want to thank you for watching this episode of the Retro Rogues Live. Again, I've been one of your hosts. My name is Dave Beatty. You can see more of my artwork, keep up with the interesting things. You can still download the first issue of the Retro Rogues fanzine that is still available on the website. It's going to be available there for a very, very long time to come. But you can obviously do all that, see all that, and hopefully pretty soon we'll have some exciting announcements about some other cool things we're going to be doing there, and give you new ways to sort of enjoy hopefully what we're doing here with the Retro Rogues. But that and so much more can be found at my website. That's at davebeatty.com. That's www.davebeaty.com. I want to thank Mr. Eric Alexander, of course, being here, providing his unique insight, coming up with all the fun stories from pop culture news as well as streaming wars, providing his unique insight into the various films and the shows that we're discussing as well. Please, Eric, tell the folks hopefully watching or listening at home where they can learn more about you on the interwebs.
Well, I'm most active on Twitter. You can find me at BaseGod14. That's at BASSGOD14. My DMs are always open on Twitter. So if you have a suggestion about the show, we had some good suggestions earlier about things that maybe you want us to take a look at or review. We definitely are always open to that. The DMs are always open. BaseGod14 is also my YouTube channel, which is the outlet that we use for YouTube on this show officially. Also, it's the Twitch, and that's also another official outlet for the show. So please share that with your friends, and so we can grow the channel and get some more wonderful discussions from the Rogues Gallery. And I'm going to go back to a comment from James from earlier tonight, something that we actually missed. And he said, forums died when Facebook groups became popular. And with that, we will leave our viewers with the last word.